أشار له المسؤولون العسكريون.
The United States is in a state of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that the majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı. Ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello and welcome to Varn Blog's election night special, although post night, because I think talking about it during the actual election is stupid. Sorry, other shows that do that. So today we have a panel who's going to play off me and moderate my doominess. I predicted a lot of things last night, and a lot of what I predicted came to pass, and a lot of what I predicted didn't come to pass. And what we're going to talk about primarily is in what ways did the historical trends stay the same, and in what days did we actually see a shift from historical norms, and why may this not be a victory or a defeat for certain parties. One thing, though, I'm going to start off with my preposition, is I think Trumpism in general has been repudiated in the popular imagination, and we're going to have to figure out why the media gave it more clout in the GOP imagination than it actually had. However, let's start before, let's not, roast the chicken before we caught it. I'm going to introduce 3 of our 4 panel members. Jeremy Salmon will be joining us in about an hour, and I will be taking Patreon members in my Discord may be coming on to ask questions and ask for clarifications and talk about their specific states. So this is going to be a little bit more of a participatory show than we normally have. No, I don't have a phone line you can call into. I haven't figured out how to make that work. And frankly, I'm not inclined to. But tonight we will have more audience participation. I will also actually read the comments for once. So we will work from there. We will also have the actual political map for us to talk about, because we don't know who won all these elections. And right now, while we have statistical likelihoods, shit's weird. But our panel to talk about why shit is weird is representing the East Coast, one of the non-reactionary Lashians and young people. More sanguine on the Democrats than me, but not stupid. Elijah Emery, welcome.
Great to be here. Wonderful to be able to talk to everybody in, a time which is not as despondent as many of us would have thought, but still sufficiently despondent that this show can continue informing the American people.
Yes. If things go super well, I'm out of a job. So, we also have holding down the position of Florida man, J.G.Michaels. How does it feel to be in the epicenter of the beast, J.G.?
Oh, I hate it here. I just all this time running up to midterms, I've been having to see this commercial, the campaign ad for Ron DeSantis, and it's him basically doing like a tribute to Top Gun with all the visuals from Top Gun, but it's called Top Dove. And I hate this state. I mean, I love it in some ways, but yeah.
I normally defend red states, but Florida is not one I've traditionally defended, and now I'm less inclined to. And holding down our position of West Coast elite is Jordan Dubin. Jordan, how are you doing?
It's good to be back after 14 years living outside of the country. California is more or less just like I left it. Still sucks.
Yeah. It's a funny thing about that I am amazed at is one of the victors last night, despite actually changing historical trends, is inertia.
Yeah. Isn't that something? Yeah.
So we're going to talk about that. And so I'm going to throw this up to you. I'm going to pull up the electoral map per Google. I'm going to pick Google because Google's, going to be fairly nonpartisan, I guess, as far as it goes. So many screens. So many screens. All right. And so also visiting us
is
Google Analytics. All right. And so we can see here what we have right now as far as areas we can call. Dems have 46 safe seats. GOP has 48. However, it looks like Lake is going to lose in Arizona. That's Arizona, right? That's governor. So Arizona looks to be favoring Mark Kelly, but just slightly. Blake Masters is doing less well than the Republicans would have hoped.
Thank God.
Utah, Mike Lee clearly won, but as you can see, and then Matt Mullen for a non-party candidate. In fact, he's not even part of the party he helped found. Got 41% of the vote here. Democrats didn't even run anybody. Colorado seems solidly blue on this map. It wasn't even that close. Featherman, I wouldn't say crushed it, but is beating Mehmet Oz with the coveted Oprah endorsement.
Yeah, gotta get that.
Georgia is yet again a runoff. It looks like Horsa Rocker is within 1 percentage point of losing. So given the way runoffs tend to run, they tend to favor more well-off white voters in the suburban counties of Atlanta, which traditionally has favored Republicans, and according to some people adjacent to the DSA, supposedly still does, but definitely it doesn't anymore, as Elijah's going to remind us in a few minutes. So how should socialists feel about this election? I think we're going to come to that more towards the end. But I'm already looking at the way both the news media and Biden is framing this, and I'm not feeling great. So let's see. We now looked at the House. The House is also too close to call, but I'm guessing it's going to go barely to the GOP. Although we're talking about a ruling majority of like maybe 3 to 4 seats. So even though we did get a red ripple or a red trickle or something in the House, and maybe we got hemorrhagic bleeding, we're not getting what was hoped for there. But again, this map is a lot redder, and we'll talk more about that. Now let's look at governors. Governors are interesting. So the GOP lost 2 governors, and the Democrats gained 2, but they gained 2 in areas that you were trying to figure out how the hell those states had Republican governors anyway. So while Vermont Vermont's red, by the way. That's fun. Good old Bernie Sanders country. And New Hampshire's red, which is not surprising at all for people who know the region. We see that, for example, Massachusetts, which has had a Republican governor for fairly, and a lot of these cycles, even though it's traditionally a blue state at the national level, now has a Democratic governor. We, however, also concede that the Democrats wasted a ton of money on Stacey Abrams and Beto O'Rourke. And their attempts to break into the South, despite their seeming demographic leads in those areas, have not really panned out. So we have these issues here. And we're going to talk about that, because another thing that we're going to have to deal with is the get out the vote operation and the Democratic Party operations in these states are not the operations of the party or the DNC. They are literally the operations of Beto O'Rourke and Stacey Abrams. And it is not clear that anyone's going to benefit from that now that they have lost. So we'll come back there. Houses, state houses are a bit harder to call. Those elections are still being counted, and no one nationally is really keeping up with them in the same way. But we've
got some info on them.
Yeah, we do have some info. But before we start our panel and really breaking this down, hi Rob, you have a question.
Hi, yeah. Well, that got me off guard. Sorry. I just wondered what you thought about Michigan, and specifically, it's just early stuff, but there's some talk about them trying to repeal right to work there now that the Democrats have the trifecta, which I think is something worth looking into.
I feel like watching the northern the Rust Belt go back blue, except for Ohio, which we can now firmly say is a red state, totally a red state, actually, all the way through and through, is interesting for the long-term perspective of the Democrats and for labor activism in general. The question is going to be, even if they do reverse right to work, we've had a general weakening of state laws around labor rights, period. And that has not been reversed by the recent campaigns for unionization. So it's very hard for me to say. I think hopefully we see that the Democrats return some loyalty to labor because they've used it, but we also have a bunch of time bombs with labor coming out soon that the Democrats are going to have to make some hard political choices, and generally those hard political choices have never actually favored the unions, even when the unions are giving them a ton of money. The biggest one's going to be the railroad situation. But we also have a lot of situations with schooling where the Democratic governors have had to adopt similar decredentialing party policies as Republican governors. It's simply not the labor force, despite the fact it is highly unpopular with labor unions in those areas. As far as Michigan goes, I think it's good. I've been the partner that I live with is from Michigan, and I've been worried about Michigan becoming, the Bible bra again. I was not sure how long the Hope College mentality it was going to maintain. I think another thing we have to look at is Wisconsin is probably can be said to be a red state on the state level, which is another thing, even though it's going to be blue on the national level. And I think this is going to be similar to Georgia. So the victory in Michigan is actually more important in that way, because generally the trend has been from the Democrats to focus on national issues at the exclusion of local ones, to the point that they have not had good ground game in a lot of these Rust Belt states. One thing I would be interested to see, though, is what kind of Democrats these people actually operate under. Are they going to follow the Biden initiative? Or are they going to follow a more progressive one? And what kind of pushback are they going to get? With the situation being what it is in Detroit and all kinds of reforms being needed in that area, let's hope that they do the politically wise thing. But again, I mean, the reason why we think this is a big deal is because we're so used to Democrats losing so epically, particularly in the first term of a Democratic president, that we are having trouble like looking at something that's really kind of a wash but favoring the Democrats. It's a good night for the Democrats, but not a great night. And looking at it as such a win because our standards have been lowered by 3 decades of just total and utter failure. Anyone else have an opinion about Michigan? I've been talking a lot before I ask Rob if he has anything else he wants to ask us.
I know AIPAC spent a ton of money there this year. Wonder how that turned out for everyone.
Into the
With
toilet.
their new super PAC. Yeah.
Yeah. AIPAC is going to increasingly seemingly go the route of the NRA. It's no longer reaching out to a bipartisan consensus, and it's specifically targeting progressives. Even if progressives do not have a strong stance on Israel one way or another.
Indeed.
The in terms of Michigan, I think one thing which is very important is that it's pretty clear. I think the difference between Michigan and Wisconsin is a very good one to talk about, because it's the difference between a state that's anchored by a large metropolitan area, which could continue to give Democrats pretty good margins over the course of the next decade, and a state with a declining, with a reliance on declining Democratic votes in the rurals, which is the case in Wisconsin. So Michigan more encapsulates a lot of trends that happen because of a few things. There was an independent commission that went in there. And the result of this is that for the first time since 86 or 82, Democrats have a trifecta there. But it's not going to result in what we've seen electorally in a lot of states, where it's you get a trifecta and then you're able to run like in illiberal democracy. You're like an Orbanist or whatever.
Yeah, like the Republicans did in South Carolina, for example, or have effectively actually done in Georgia, where it's a 50-50 state, but you wouldn't know it from the way Republicans actually ran until recently when they wanted to run away from fucking Trump.
Or Wisconsin, where Democrats won the governor's race and they came very close in the Senate race, but lost the overwhelming majority of state seats because it's just gerrymandered into oblivion.
And if I recall correctly, the state house there then passed something trying to limit the powers of the governor, like 2 days after that he was elected or something.
Yep, they did.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of Michigan, I think the main takeaway from Michigan is it's very good that these lunatic, anti-abortionists, got completely shellacked. But ultimately, this is just a result of the fact that Michigan is not, in fact, a state that is going to be irredeemably red for the rest of our lifetimes. It's a very in the middle state, and things can go one way or the other.
Yeah. I think one of the things that we're going to have to deal with, and one of the things that I've pointed out, is in purple states, the electorate is actually increasingly inelastic, and to use political science terms. So that means that people are doubling down on their political identities. And what happens is what matters is who gets out the vote where. In states that are more clearly red or blue, for example, Utah for me, which is one of the reddest states in the country. Like I said, the Democrats didn't even run a Senate candidate here because they didn't want to be embarrassed. And because there was no real viable option for them outside of Salt Lake City. Although they should be doing better here than they are, because the Democrats are 1/3 of the population. You see a different sort of trend where moderate Republicans really are still kind of are doing better than Trumpist ones. Even on the state level, the Trumpist ones tend to lose. Similarly, in a very blue state, like California, you see actually a lot more range of policies within the Democratic Party, honestly, from things that we would consider Republican light all the way to, you know, the People's Republic of the Bay Area. But I think that usually actually betrays, however, that California progressive ballot initiatives actually don't do that well when they do well in red states. So it tells you that the political capture there means that there is actually more political diversity within a party. The exceptions obviously are going to be Ohio and Florida, and we'll talk more about that later, where like these were purple states that have clearly consolidated one way. And why that's happened probably has to do with age. It has to do with a lot of things. But we're going to have to go more into it. And there's a lot of the South we didn't learn anything about because they didn't have elections this round. So like we don't know much about what's going on in Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, Mississippi, North Carolina. We don't know that much about what's going on in Louisiana. Although I will say that a lot of people have been laughing at states making slavery formally illegal without realizing that that affects prison populations and actually does have effects. So Utah, what's the state, Kentucky and whatnot, actually passing that's a big deal. And I will note that that means in a lot of blue states, prison slavery is technically legal because it's legal.
Virginia. Oh, sorry about that.
No, go ahead.
Virginia refused to make it illegal when Democrats did have a trifecta because of their worries that it would affect state coffers.
Yep. So yeah, see, I brought you on. I knew that you weren't going to just kiss Democratic ass tonight. But Elijah's usually the voice of my ear being like, Derick, be more fair to the Democrats. You can't hate them all the time.
You can hate them all the time. It's just that you know, you have to recognize why the appropriate level of hatred, I feel like. But you should hate them.
So let's look at this. I actually think this is an interesting point made by one of the members of my audience. But come on, spiritual man, like come on before I dismiss Rob here. The strength of Michigan has a lot to do with a lot of the medium-sized cities outside of Detroit that provide Democratic seats, whereas Wisconsin has 2 counties that are 80-20 Dem, and then everywhere else is like 65-35R. What I find interesting about that, though, is when you compare that to another state with a lot of mid-sized cities that you think would go in this direction, the obvious comparison state is Ohio, where there is a ton of mid-sized cities. Like you got Dayton, Cleveland, Toledo. I'm forgetting cities, but there's like 7. All of whom are mid-sized, and yet the demographic arguments have gone exactly in the other direction. And I would like to, Youngstown, thank you, really kind of break that down. Spiritual man, let's caveat those numbers are rough and not pulled from recent polling, which is fine. Does anyone have a theory before I let Rob go here, why that might be the case? Like, why are we seeing this workout? I mean, honestly, Michigan and Ohio are similar states in a lot of ways, but let's talk about the ways in which they maybe aren't. They're both former Rust Belt states. They both got destroyed in 2007. They're both historically purplish states, although Michigan has generally been bluer than Ohio historically. Why has it seemed like we've seen a total consolidation of GOP power in Ohio with similar city conditions, and we haven't seen that in the other 2 major Rust Belt states, Pennsylvania and Michigan, and in fact we've seen Republicans lose power?
I mean, Michigan is blacker than Ohio is.
Well, that's the
2%.
obvious one.
I don't know enough about either to say anything, to be honest with you.
I do have one friend who used to live in Ohio, and the one thing that used to drive him insane was that the Ohio Supreme Court I believe under this cycle, they were competing under maps that were deemed unconstitutional, but like the Dems didn't really put up much of a legal fight. So I hate to be the boring institutionalist here, but it could be just someone didn't do the paperwork, and you get washed.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was following that court fight a little bit, and there is a very significant change that happened here. So in this case, these were redrawn by the court. There was some back and forth. There was a lot of fighting, but just the way that the courts work in the state is they continually put on like an injunction or whatever that just throws it back to the state legislature. So it's part of the just odd dynamics of how election law works in Ohio. What did happen in both Ohio and North Carolina is that there had been these major cases regarding redistricting because there was a small Democratic majority on both of the state Supreme Courts. That is no longer true. And for that reason, both of those states are going to get gerrymandered between now and 2024. Be very heavily Republican.
Yeah. While gerrymandering sometimes helps out Democrats, i.e. California and New York, usually it helps Republicans. So thank you, Rob. You have any other questions before I let you go? Because
yeah, one thing. The line that everyone seems to do like every single cycle is to say like, Latinos are not homogenous, or demographics. Start talking about it like it is, blah 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 blah. But they never really seem to like do the second part of that to say, okay, then how should we taxonomize it? Like, what are the groups we can split them into? No one ever really seems to say that, and so I'm kind of interested to hear whether you think that's possible to do, and so on.
So one thing I would say, you need to break Latin people. You have the Guaisano vote, which is white Cuban and white Venezuelan middle class immigrants. But you also have a conservatizing of a lot of the Southern Chicano vote. And that's going to be largely generational. So what we see is in Texas, we've seen a lot of conservatized Latin politicians. Also, it is important to note that historically speaking, both the Latin vote and the Asian vote has generally gone to Republicans, and we've seen a slight return to that norm. And in fact, maybe one of the interesting things we can talk about is why that norm hasn't been going faster. Because one of the things I was afraid of is that we'd have basically what I like to call the Tory problem, which is conservatives, and they did try this during the George W. Bush administration. Trump effectively ended this as a strategy, but conservatives running, for lack of a better term, token minority candidates for very conservative positions. And it's important to note that like the first female prime minister and the first prime minister of color, if you don't count Benjamin Disraeli, which I don't, in the UK were both Tories. All right. So I think we'll see a return to that tactic now that Trumpism has seemed to be somewhat repudiated. Herschel Walker is problematic and as Trumpy of a candidate as he is, as well as what's his face from California 2 years ago, who ran against Newsom.
Jordan, you're our California expert.
Yeah.
I was living in the Middle East then.
Yeah, she was living in Israel.
I'm very sorry. I was on lockdown constantly. I couldn't even look at the internet. Let's find out.
Someone's calling me a Stalinist for using the Gasano slur, and so, I'm gonna laugh at that. Larry Elder. So this has been attempted on the GOP spectrum, but it doesn't seem to work with the black voters as well as it might with the Latin voters. And again, there's probably complicated reasons as to why. So we can go on talking more about that. Any other questions?
Nothing that comes to mind.
All right. Thank you for coming on, Rob. Let's talk a little bit about that, actually, when we talk a little bit about one thing I'm going to say that I think Elijah may push back on a little bit is that I find the Democrats' racial narrative to be largely unconvincing. Outside of the black vote in specific, there is not a large correlation right now between the consolidation of Florida and Texas illustrates that high immigrant proportion states that are probably going to be majority minority, but for the rest of the country still are trending fairly conservative. And in some districts, that is also in largely minority districts. Why do you think that is, and why should the Democrats not be concerned?
I don't think the Democrats should not be concerned. First of all, because, how you lose elections is you're not concerned about things for anybody. I do disagree a little bit with putting specifically Florida and South Texas in together. And you can see this in the relative shift. So Florida Hispanics so far seem to have gone 17% more Republican than they did in 2020. And Hispanics I know Southern Texas, but it might be true of the whole state, went 3% more conservative. Yeah, so this is a pretty different relative shift.
Right. And it's a different demographic group, let's be honest.
It's a different demographic group. And Hispanics in the Rio Grande Valley and in South Florida and in other parts of the country are certainly not a monolith. So there's relative underperformances happening with certain groups of Hispanics in particular places. And it's in very, very high profile places. But, in a lot of other states, like it's seeming like Nevada is going to deliver a Democrat to the Senate, at least, maybe not governor, with a majority of the Hispanic vote. So it's just, it's very contingent. And as you said before, the only ethnic group which is really like uniformly a bloc, or racial group, I should say, is Black voters.
Yeah, let's be clear. The progressive and social democratic vote is the whitest vote in the country. So the idea of these racial blocs, it's interesting to me because one of the things I always joke about the DSA is you go to a DSA meeting and you think it's super diverse and then you realize it's 80% white men. But because of the quotas, they've had to put every single woman in and person of color in the group into leadership to be able to maintain their leadership quotas. Which tells me also as a strategy that doesn't work, because if that worked, you would see diversity amongst the general population. You don't see it. And in fact, if anything, I suspect it burns people out faster. I think that it's kind of the open secret is the Democratic Socialist vote is hard to gauge because no one other than the DSA is really monitoring it. Pew talks about progressives and also outsider leftists, and depending on how you answer questions for Pew as a socialist, you could be in either group. Outsider leftists or outsider liberals actually range in opinion pretty hugely from socialist to almost Republican moderate, the way they set up that phrasing. So for example, there's a lot of Bernie people in there who are not in the progressive categories for the Pew polls, but there's also a lot of might be a Youngkin voter in Virginia, but might also generally be a Democrat. I guess we might call them blue and yellow dog Democrats that fall into that category. It is more racially diverse. So when we talk about the DSA, we're talking about a group of, I think right now about 60,000 people, about 62,000. They've lost 12,000 from their former membership in the last year. So they're not a growing group anymore and haven't been for about a year. And 12,000 from their good standing. If you actually look at the numbers from their projected numbers a year ago, it's something like 20,000. But part of that is their projected numbers were overestimates. So what does that mean, right? Well, it means that the left, its relationship to the larger Democratic Party is pretty damn obscure right now. And the DSA has not clarified that. So yeah, and of course there's the normal Republicans make gains with black men and women and Latin men and women in this midterm compared to the last midterm. Also true, but not nearly as much as they predicted, or even normal polls predicted. That seems to have been slowed. If I was predicting off of the growth, for example, experienced under even in 2020 under Trump, I would have predicted larger gains in those communities across the board. And I was actually, I was kind of wrong on that. I thought that we'd see a faster shift because, and this is kind of the irony of this situation, we have seen a diversification of the middle class, partly from immigrants, but partly also from actual some lower in mobility in the South. And it was going to be interesting to see how COVID played into that. Ultimately, it seems like the Supreme Court is what stopped that. But I also think if we look at New York and California, we saw that Republicans actually overperformed there. And this leads me to something that you noticed, Elijah. What do you think is driving that?
So in New York, there's a couple of things. I can't speak as much to California. So New York has a few things going on. One, a lot of it is anti-crime activation on behalf of like people who are really scared of the New York Post. And Lee Zeldin campaigned as like an anti-crime guy, which is hilarious because wherever he went, there was like more crimes. Like he was single-handedly driving the crime epidemic in New York. But the ramifications of Andrew Cuomo's stalking the Supreme Court with reliable conservatives to shoot down, relatively progressive policies resulted in the overturning of a gerrymander, which opened New York up to a miniature red wave. And then there's a couple of other like hilarious underperformances revolving around these, weird things that don't happen in other states, like the Hasidic vote, for example, all of which resulted in the necessary ingredients for a Republican overperformance. And then there's one other big thing, which is that my view is that what drove a lot of people to the Democrats this time is abortion. And in New York, nobody was concerned about abortion being made illegal. So they could vote off of crime and inflation, which are issues that they blame on the Democratic Party.
Which I think we see that in California too. I mean, one, the California, I think people underestimate how red parts of Orange County and whatnot actually are.
Anything east of major cities as well, for the most part. The further out you get into the periphery, the redder that you find yourself. And that's discounting Orange County and other massive metropolises that are much more like that. San Diego, too, has a huge military presence, naval base forever. You're always going to have pockets here as well that are surprising. I saw that city council is overwhelmingly Democratic, but we had pickups for Republicans here and there. We have some of the craziest ones in the country as well.
I was going to say, your Republicans are notably crazier than Utah Republicans. Like
it's really special, actually. I'm not quite sure exactly how that happens, but yeah, it's another state where we don't have to worry about certain issues that were such hot topics. But you've also seen people leaving California en masse since 2015, and the numbers just got so much bigger. Where are they going? They're going into states like Texas, into Utah. I'm sure you've met plenty of lovely Californians, and you're part of the woods.
If you ever come and visit me, Jordan, do not admit you're from California. You may not survive if you.
I was born in Florida.
That probably won't help either.
Nothing helps me. What can I say?
Also, being Jewish probably didn't help either. But
no, I'm Canadian. Sorry.
Also doesn't help.
What do you do?
Are you LDS? No, I'm kidding.
Right, exactly.
If you're not LDS from Provo, you're kind of screwed. I'm joking. Actually, I find Utah to be interesting because it's both more and less reactionary than you think it is simultaneously. So looking at that, we see that, I think what we have is a weirdly mobilized public. I also want to talk about the polls a little bit. We haven't even got to how socialists could feel and how we should define factions. I'm going to wait for Jeremy Salmon to come on because he really wants me to try to specify both these demographic factors and these political factions within the groups. Because one of the things I have said for the past 2 decades, even when I was a conservative, that movement conservatism died in the first cycle of George Bush. In their seeming victory after 9/11, they collapsed. And that the Tea Party, even though it was kind of astroturfed and bought back in ways that I think should make democratic socialists actually slightly uncomfortable, because there are some ways in which its story sounds a little bit like ours, as an internal opposition movement that is that like its original members are clearly marginalized, and then you have a large astroturfing and a lot of money pouring in to marginal figures. That happened with the Tea Party. The Tea Party thus folds pretty quickly because it's so attached to the anti-Obama movement, even though its origins are actually in the anti-Bush movement. And then Trumpism emerges because there's no clear winner. But as I pointed out to people, Trumpism is attachment to a person. It was never a coherent political philosophy. Which is always why I was like, it's not even fascist. It actually in some ways scares me more than fascism, because I kind of know what different kinds of fascists are going to do.
What do you do with cult of personality that has zero platform?
Like charisma and saying everything to all people while also being a dick is a much harder thing to predict. And that kind of was Trump's, if you actually look at Trump's achievements, he accelerated things that have begun under Republicans that were maintained or even accelerated under Obama, but made them meaner. Right? That was pretty much his accomplishments. Like, it was just to make standard GOP talking points dickier, which is interesting. And that was something that I thought may have hurt the Democrats with the Latin vote, because frankly, there's been a lot of frustration that there has been no movement on things around border issues, around streamlining immigration from Latin countries in particular. And there's been a lot of people in those communities who feel particularly abandoned, but apparently the Supreme Court has scared them into caring and staying loyal. And so that's an interesting predicament. So I think the problem that we have, though, is I also don't think the Democrats have a coherent politics right now either.
Not that guy. We're not that guy. He's awful. We're also not lizard people. We promise. That's what they were saying, but they're wrong. It's just become absolute insanity since Trump. The anti-Trump bloc was not offering much by way of solutions to any of the problems that were being posed. And if kids in cages were a problem for Californians several years ago, well, we still have the kids in cages, and they don't seem to care about that much now. It's just a matter of who's in power. Even in Corona times, Gavin Newsom was so incredibly unpopular, and he's maintained certain amounts of unpopularity. I think that drives a lot of politics here.
Even though he's popular outside of California now amongst Democrats looking for a leader.
Absolutely. Yeah, go to Florida and tell them to come. that you're not doing much for the people here, according to what they have to say. And it's just become influencer politics running on names.
Well, I find this interesting, though, because we're going to have to come back to the Beto and Stacey Abrams problem about the influencer politics and the Democratic Party's love of losers. Like literally, they love to promote losers to their national political eye, but there's a reason for that. And I can go into the history around that. But I think there's a point here that the pro-abortion thing, more than other attempts at anti-Trumpism, is at least consistent with we are the party of status quo civil rights. We're not going to take civil rights away from you.
Well,
right?
I think one thing which is very funny about this is that there actually was a coherent political agenda on which people could have run, and they didn't. I mean, we had over the course of the Biden administration, one big difference from the Trump administration is that there was advanced a coherent industrial policy, which is certainly not the industrial policy I would have preferred, but is coherent. And it covers both massive funding of states in the American Rescue Plan, subsequently the massive infrastructure thing.
Hey,
Jeremy, nice to meet you. I'm Elijah.
How you doing?
Good
evening. No, sorry, I had a therapist appointment that I was late getting home from.
That's fine.
But anyway, I'll close out very quickly. Then there was the Inflation Reduction Act, which was really substantial in terms of its actual impact on a number of issues which are supposedly the forefront politically. Right. And then yet, considering all of this, most of the campaign ads turned on abortion, which was something that was reactive and on opposing, election deniers and lunatics, which was also reactive. And so there was positive stuff to run on, but they ran on the negative stuff.
Well, here's a couple of things. I do want to push back a little bit on the Inflation Act. One, I think it will have an effect on inflation in 4 to 5 years, which is remarkably slow in terms of historical economic policy. Two, it's contested in the IMF, and there is a chance that Europe will win on stopping. It's funny. Europe's going to stop American progressive policy, which is pretty hilarious. But nonetheless, it does put Europe at a strategic trade disadvantage. Three, one thing that I think is interesting about this industrial policy, it's also clearly aimed at accelerating tensions with China, which is a big problem for us. And one of the things I think is weirdly bipartisan right now is center, left, and right have dissident voices who want to calm situations with China, and center, left, and right have mainstream voices that basically want Cold War with China and maybe with Russia too. But the Republicans seem to be okay with Russia for weird reasons that I can go into later. I think one of the interesting things about that is one of the strange things about the Inflation Reduction Act is it's actually the only climate bill that, even though it doesn't do what we promised to do in the Paris Accords, even though it's kind of shitty, it's actually the best one we've ever gotten through Congress. And I say this because I think it's a shit climate bill, and I think a lot of Democrats were overselling it. But they were actually right in this one element, that they got something that was anti-climate things through Congress by, and I think this is important, not tying it to carbon taxes, because that is regressive the way it's normally implemented, and not tying it to cap and trade bullshit, which is what's made Elon Musk rich, because that's really what Tesla actually deals in, not cars. Tesla's main source of income is selling off carbon offsets. That's actually where most of their stock value comes from. There's also a chance of which the chip people talk about, the chip sanctions thing, will also weirdly probably lead to an overproduction in chips, and it probably won't help the US that much, but it will hurt China. So it's kind of a lose scenario.
Nice.
And as I've said, another thing that I think people aren't, and I think Biden's chosen to run on this, and we're going to talk more about this in a minute. And I'm going to let Jeremy talk and take a break because I've been going for 3 hours. I need to use the bathroom. For you guys who don't know, I did a whole hour and 45-minute show before this.
Yeah, marathon man here.
But I think what is interesting about this for me is that we can see that the Biden agenda is not popular even amongst Democrats, and Biden's popularity, while it has eked up a little bit, it's now eked up to the historically low standards of Trump and Obama, both of whom were historically low for this point in the midterms. So general political dissatisfaction with the executive remains the same. But people really, really hate the GOP now in a way that they didn't even a year ago. Like, there was a real chance. I think a year ago, if the Supreme Court decision had not happened and the GOP did not act the way it did once it happened, there was a chance that there really would have been a red wave.
It was like a wave pool. Have you ever been at one of those at a water park?
Oh, those are fun.
Yeah, but you stay in the same place, you know? It kind of works.
Or even another image. How about, you can't really get a unit of measurement out of this, but what about a full set of Overlook Hotel elevator full of a red wave?
Oh God. But it just keeps going back into the elevator and then coming out.
All right. So I'm going to turn over to co-host Jeremy Salmon. And I'm calling you Salmon because that's what a friend of the show, Jason Miles, calls you. Not Salmon for some reason. But
yeah, it is how it's spelled, but yeah.
And then we're going to ask JG to report from hell, aka Florida, and talk about the utter consolidation of Ron DeSantis and what this means as movement conservatism continues to decline, but nothing replaces it. But first, Jeremy, take the lead. What's going on in Portland? How did the Democrats do in Oregon?
Well, Oregon, much like many West Coast states, is effectively, you could say it's kind of like a one-party state. Especially, I mean, I live in Portland, where our current mayor, and the only reason he is still mayor is because of he was up for election 2 years ago when all the fun was going on, and we had a counter candidate, but also a write-in candidate who took effectively just enough votes away that good old Ted Wheeler, a fourth or fifth generation timber heir, multimillionaire, of course. His family has a town and a county in the state of Oregon named after him, was able to be reelected also he was ex-GOP, but he changed his party because you can't get elected in he wasn't going to get elected to Portland mayorship for that. So it's a it's one of those things where, yeah, much like with California, or plenty of other states where you get a lot of people who would be happily, like, Republican registered, but you can't exactly get elected that way. The fun is going on here is we had our governor's race was not quite too close to top. I think Tina Kotek, the Democratic nominee, is pretty much has it, even though one of the major suburban major suburban counties, but pretty much any suburban county is going to be far more reactionary than Portland. It declared that they were going to hold off publishing the results of their vote until 5:00 today. Oregon is a 100% vote by mail, which is an awesome system that I really recommend everybody doing, that a lot more people got to try out during pandemic, because it is a place where you and all of your idiot friends can cast your vote in a bar, or you can sit on the kitchen table with your family and write your vote there. You can have your cat there giving you advice. So
that's illegal. No, I'm kidding.
Depends on the age of the cat and
where they're from.
Yeah.
What the hell did you guys do when I left? What's wrong? What's going on? What are you
No,
talking about
just,
cats?
I'm just updating people onto the state of the Oregon political scene, such as it is. But right
You
now
can
we
vote
have,
by mail with your cat.
yeah.
Did you know that, Varn?
Well, your cat can help you vote. I mean, your cat is not allowed to sign your ballot. You have to too, because otherwise that's probably some form of fraud. But
See, that's what I was saying.
yeah, it was we had during the we mentioned the aforementioned how issues 2 years ago that had a lot of people kind of just full multi-alarm fire were freaking out. Turns out to be not nearly as pertinent anymore, like say having DeJoy and the US screwing around with the US Post Office and doing things like say screwing around with postal boxes, because if you are a vote by mail state, your post box is also a ballot collection box.
Right.
And we had a lot of things where they were either they were scheduled to be some of them were scheduled to be repaired, some were, I think, just so happened to be moved around during very weird times a couple of years ago. And guess what? 2 years later, DeJoy is still in power. So
why?
That well, you know why. I think anyway, what's going on? One of the topics I did want to bring up to amongst many other things is talking about, and this is very relevant to Portland and also the mayoral race in Los Angeles and pretty much anywhere else, but the increasing propensity of blue metros in like rich dim cities to where like the local city politics effectively is just coming down to like which candidate wants to genocide houseless people harder. Where we have a big thing here in Portland has a weak mayor, strong city council, where you have effectively I'm going to screw things up because I am not a member of the electoral working group, but where we have I think something like our city council, something like 5 people, and all but pretty much only one of them just got challenged and just got Joanne Hardesty, which a bunch of who kind of I've actually met her several times. But also she was the only renter on the city council. She was the only Black woman on the city council, and she was the only she was the one who was actually, during the uprising would actually come out and to talk to people rather than just kind of, make much more like Law and Order type noises and such. She just lost to a candidate who just so happened to put on a lot of like, say, anti-mask rallies 2 years ago, and is one of those things where it's very much kind of like a tool or prompt of a lot of like local like real estate and kind of reactionary like homeowners groups and whatnot. And the entire thing here is, I think we mentioned before about how like crime is like one of the big issues this time. I think one of the other issues, I think a little factor to mention, is how Adam and Nima at Citations Needed talk about this a lot, how crime is kind of becomes equivalent for just visible poverty, just seeing like houseless people on the streets. It's kind of a thing where just because if you see that and that between with like local news kind of like upset.
Can I speak to that a little bit? I mean,
go for it.
I guess
you posted that NPR article, right?
Yeah,
I'm very curious what's in there.
I posted it against actually trends even on the left right now who
Certainly
have taken a weird stance on crime. People who called for abolishing or usually defunding the police a few years ago. Where to start? Jeremy, I know that I'm going to sound unpopular, but I don't think the activists in Oregon actually help themselves on this.
That a lot of times, yeah, not really. I think there's a little bit of a disconnection there sometimes.
I mean, I remember Robert Evans like talking about how Portland was the future of the rest of the United States, and I literally like spit my coffee out laughing at my computer. I was like, no, that's actually fucking Phoenix, Arizona is the future of the rest of the United States. Portland is specifically weird. I mean, and by weird, I don't mean, oh, it's cool and hip like a lot of people. I mean, like it's a largest urban area with no central city that is incredibly white compared to the rest of the other metropolitan areas, even compared to like Salt Lake City. That is where there's no suburbia separating rural and urban. So Greater Idaho pretty much goes right up to the city gates.
The urban Portland, for those who don't know, voted in an urban growth boundary back in the 70s. So sprawl here happened differently than everywhere else. And so, yeah, white flight here is, I don't know, 5 miles that way. You can bike it.
Yeah, I mean, so it's and it's also white flight from like what 10%?
Whiteness.
like
beige flight, ecru flight. Yeah.
This is off white to the purest of white linen.
Exactly.
What's also, I think it is also housing, because like Portland also one of those places where, what was it? I was reading I think a couple of years ago that as a nation we haven't really built social housing in full since the 70s.
No, we really haven't.
Yeah,
and
in Portland,
out west is worse.
Yeah.
Oh, they just refuse to do it out here because it's not profitable, and there's too many zoning issues because you have to have so much, parking spaces, and then the contractors that are willing to do low-income housing can't put underground parking, and what are they going to do with these units if they can't sell them for
my unpopular opinion
is
rent control doesn't work. You need social housing, not rent control.
Because then there's not a motivation for landlords to keep any rent controlled places livable.
Yeah. So I do want to like say that a lot of the fact that, I don't know, I've run into these people, upper middle class white activist, really coming up and advocating for what are sometimes serious progressive policies, but doing so in ways that are really disruptive to even social workers. Like the great debate on whether or not social workers were cops on Twitter, which I've actually seen in real time. Social workers and teachers are aware of our role in the carceral state. Most of us don't like it. The opinion is kind of, however, varied depending on region and personality, frankly. But I want people to really stop and think about this right now. One of the other problems that we have in California is the answers to this have been where there has been some social housing building. There's also the requisition of derelict hotels that are being done, which is steps in the right direction. But California spent a ridiculous amount of money on NGOs to do what could be done cheaper by a government agency in orders of scale. Like, we're talking billions and billions of dollars.
Absolutely.
You gotta love the public-private partnerships. They make everything better.
So I think this is part of why people have like no imagination here. And what the Democrats want to do is what Democrats in these cities want to do where they're safer. And like Elijah and I were both talking about this, in these blue areas that are safely blue, there's actually also a wider range of opinion of what it means to be a Democrat. Just like in these red areas that are safely red, there's a wider range of opinion of what it means to be a Republican. This is a sociological easy bet, but this is also why it's very hard for anyone to actually run third-party movements or get progressive stuff done in a lot of these states. Because in areas where you don't have total ideational rigidity, you also don't have a lot of movement right now at all. And the movement, even in Democratic strongholds, is actually kind of to the right. We've seen basically a Democratic Party that wants to bury anything it said 2 years ago during the Floyd insurrection and uprisings.
No.
It's cool that we can get Lovecraft Country on HBO and like a lot of we actually have diversity in acting, but we don't want actual real change here. Just like as I pointed out about, one of the ironies of the quota system. This is not to say that affirmative action was not actually progressive. At one point it was. There would have been no shift in basically the black bourgeoisie would have been shut out without it. And that is bad. Like, it's not that's not a good thing, people. But that the way that we see these quotas being used by universities is actually recruiting a lot of times from foreign countries. You've seen a lot of, like, for example, an increase in the representation of Nigerian and other rich black minority groups. And by the way, people are like, oh, it's Nigerians. I'm like, no, it's specifically the Nigerian super bourgeoisie, because the racial quota system we have for Africa means that unless you get refugee status, it's almost impossible for you to immigrate here. It's not like you're getting even middle class Nigerians. That's not who's coming here. You're getting the elite of the elite.
Well, yeah, if you can't do, have a more diverse set of rich kids, like, what's wrong with that? Hey, it's you get both rich kids, and you get your diversity numbers, and win-win. Yeah. Everyone's happy.
Which we've seen in universities. What we've seen then is actually class division of university graduates in the past 5 years actually get worse despite the supposed diversification of the college campuses. However, I want to put a little bit of caveat on that. It's not like there aren't more people of color from all classes going to college. There are. It's just most of them are going to community and private and for-profit private colleges and getting saddled with a fuck lot of debt. And I think that is one thing where the Democrats have kind of spoken out of both ends of their mouth. My favorite one was people arguing that forgiving student debt was a gender issue because more women have high debt loads, and I'm like, that's because more women go to college now. Like, it actually shift. It's actually something that, like, Hannah Rosen was talking about a decade ago. You can't spend that as progressive, but what we can say is that there actually is some truth that forgiving large amounts of small levels of student debt would have been a major racial relief because of the backwardness of some of these policies. And it's interesting because I know several conservatives who have been driven away from the GOP by the GOP's refusal to like, their stance on student loans, for example, has really alienated people, like wanting to make it impossible to discharge student loans at all, while also not reforming bankruptcy, has been a thing that even moderates like Mitt Romney should push.
I do have a.
You had some questions in chat, by the way, about more of an explanation on social housing and why California was funneling money through NGOs. Just wanted to throw that out there.
Where at? Who said it? Hendrickson. All right. California,
born sinner, cold world,
West Coast in general, has underdeveloped for other reasons. Georgia, indeed. It's called nature and ecology attitude. Rent control works predictably for some individuals, but which does minimize homelessness. I say minimize is a strong word, because the rent control cities actually tend to have higher homeless rates in general. Republicans aren't lying about all this stuff. But the reasons why it does is usually not the reasons why they say. Like, it does set up a perverse set of market incentives. The problem is we're using a fucking market.
Yeah.
like
can you? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I was gonna say, yeah, the market is the hand of God, and it's been like that since the Enlightenment. I thought everybody knew that,
okay, what is the reason? Okay, this is a good question.
Yeah,
what is the reason? Show up. All right.
No, you had it. You had it. Go one more.
It
go
keeps
back.
doing that. Are there any states that are actually putting money into social housing, low income?
California's actually putting more than anybody else.
Okay, there you go.
And New York has a decent homeless shelter because people freeze to death and they don't want to pay for that.
New York has a mandate that if you call, there's it's illegal to not house everyone during the winter. You
That's
can't be
beautiful.
turned away legally. You have to be given shelter in some place or another, which is why we have many fewer rough sleepers than you guys do out west, or one reason why.
Yeah. We used to have that rule in Utah, but we have given it up. I think we're now okay with person sickles.
Utah is doing like alternate things for housing though. Like I know there was this much hyped platform to just give people houses, like the Housing First one.
Yeah, yeah, I talked about that. That's been undone though for like 7 years. We started Operation Rio Grande, and they undid all that. And they also broke up the shelters downtown and put a moratorium on building new shelters. This was a Democrat in the city during COVID. So they used COVID complaints to put a moratorium on building any new shelters, and that was the one Democratic city in the state that did that. So it's like, what are you going to do? Okay, what is the reason why California distributes through NGOs? It's like purely ideological, or are there other institutional incentives that cause them to funnel through NGOs? There's a lot of institutional incentives that cause people to funnel through NGOs. Some of it is ideological. Some of it is tax breaks are encouraged even for states. And during the Reagan administration, the way block grants are administered, there is incentives for privatizing it. And actually, you can kind of thank Utah for that, because Utah uses the LDS Church to meet some of its matching needs for federal funding on block grants, which blows my mind that that's legal. And so that actually began a trend to focus on NGOs, and particularly originally religious NGOs, but now NGOs in general, as a way of doing charity, which of course makes it, not for profit, but it funnels a whole lot of money through multiple chains of middlemen. So yeah. So men are proudly boasting about being dumb. No, actually, there really is a problem with schools and men in general, because if you're not in fairly elite fields, it actually isn't a rational calculus for most men to get a degree. What do I mean by that? Like, if you're not in high competition areas like medicine, successful lawyering, or something like that, you can actually make more money as a physical laborer in trades. Although what we've seen is a lot of the physical labor trades are becoming more feminized in the last couple years. And a lot of men are dropping out of the workforce altogether. The reasons for that are complicated. And while you'll hear about like incel men and whatnot, I don't think that's actually what's going on. I think that's largely overstated. But I would be interested in knowing the real reasons why. It's a complicated social phenomenon. So yeah. Thoughts on the way social housing without recreating reactionary tendencies for homeowners who represent abolish property? No. I mean, guys, you're asking a communist who's hanging out with a bunch of social democrats to, like, give you social democratic policy.
How dare you?
Where I am like, burn it all down and start over. But in a real sense, one of the things you have to do is, I like the impulse of NIMBYism. I get where it's coming from, but it's utterly ineffective at actually dealing with building the social support networks that a lot of these people need to reintegrate into society.
Hey, hang on. NIMBYism or YIMBYism?
YIMBYism, excuse me, not NIMBYism. YIMBYism. See, I think they're both wrong, so I conflate them in my head.
We need NIMBYism, maybe in my backyard. Maybe off to the side slightly.
Yes, in my backyard. Once we redesign backyards to be properly inclusive and socialist and actually deal with the social problems and addictions and everything. But until then, it's kind of a terrible idea. Just putting someone in proximity to rich people does not fix their social problems.
Kind of like flashing back to George Lucas getting mad at all his neighbors years ago and decided to, and deliberately tried to, I can't remember what happened to this, but he was making noises that he was going to build like subsidized low cost housing in Marin County. just because he hated his neighbor so much. Except you would now have a bunch of folks who live in rent-controlled housing in the middle of Marin County.
My hometown was so racist on building social housing in the 70s and I think 80s also, that HBO made a documentary about it.
Really?
Yeah, that's it. That's an achievement.
There's like
unlocked
unbelievable
there.
power levels. It's like the base of Yonkers voters in like the 60s.
Oh yeah, you're from Yonkers.
Yonkers.
Yeah, I forget. Yes, there's been both movies and documentaries about that.
I worked with a former city council president. Wild man, completely. I have some stories, let's say. But what he does is every time he has like a new intern, he's like, I have a book for you. I want you to read it. It's called Show Me a Hero. And it's literally just like, he's like, it tells the story of how Yonkers overcame tremendous odds. And it's just an entire book about the city council being racist. To the point that assassinated. The mayor was literally assassinated after pushing through like mild social housing reform.
Jesus Christ.
But actually, one of the things that brings up something I wanted to talk about when I first got on there. You talk about just, I guess, the difference in how different metros handle, or actually increasingly rich metros just handle all of their houses problems just by effectively, just full on. Portland itself just announced that they were going to have like full on like DS9 style like sanctuary districts. I think last Friday they announced that they were going to go through this plan to have somewhere between 3 and 6 like campuses or camps or areas that houses folks could go camp in.
Yeah, you needed to reference that because not everyone watches Star Trek, Jeremy. But
hey, that episode took place in San Francisco in 2024. So shit's coming up.
And by the way, what I find interesting about that is it means the Democratic mayor of Portland is actually implementing Trump policies because that's his policy too.
That was going back to that point. Or talk about like again, our mayor is ex-GOP and got a lot of credits for. He also went through a divorce during the last term, and so it was really, really funny to have a very divorced millionaire guy trying to be like rich divorced guy in downtown Portland during the uprising when everybody has phones it would track wherever he would go and give him shit. But anyway, but like during the uprising, he got to be like resistance leader because Trump wanted to use Portland as the big target and send in friggin' BORTAC. To clamp down here, and you have this like ex-GOP, very conservative, again, multi-millionaire timber heir, like standing up for Portland, even though like he was the one who wanted to, it was almost a thing of like who's law enforcement under their control, because in Portland the mayor is also the police commissioner. Whose law enforcement under their control can beat up the most the most protester kids. But anyway, if you're just talking about like just the encampments and like what the cities are doing with their houseless populations.
Yeah, I think ultimately this is an interesting thing because the Democrats are messaging on some really strange issues now. As Elijah pointed out, even if we didn't like their industrial policy, they kind of had one that wasn't totally regressive. It was what you see from a conservative party in Europe 10 years ago. So, I mean, that makes sense. But what I would say is on city issues, we have seen a conservatization of the populists. And the populists, I actually push back on some people who are like, well, the young people are super left-wing. And one, no, they're not. Sorry. I mean, Elijah, I'll let you represent all the young. I come from the most reactionary generation. I'm a Gen Xer. But I also remember in 2005 when there was predictions that the millennials were going to be the most conservative generation ever because millennial voting patterns that were mapped were very conservative with older millennials in the early aughts. And I remember people saying their values won't change, which is hilarious because their values sure as hell changed. 2007 happened. And
we also sort of saw that with like Gen Z in a way. I remember when people were saying it was going to be the ultimate reactionary generation. Back in I think 2016, I remember articles coming out about that.
And yet, I will also say, in some ways, Gen Z is reactionary. They are the people providing some of the weirder political movements right now, but they're not conservative, and they're not going to identify with conservatives. And I also don't think they're. When I say reactionary, I'm going to be careful with that. I use reactionary in a particular way, which means no positive vision of their own. All right. I actually tend to say
Status
reactive, not even status quo. Like, I tend to say reactive as opposed to reactionary because reactionary has a right-wing connotation.
Sure.
I don't think there is a large vision coming out of Zoomers right now, and I don't blame them for that because, what did they have to build a vision on? Really?
Maybe ecologically, maybe in that degree, maybe a little bit more about like equality. I'm a millennial, so I don't know.
As a Gen Zer, I can jump in there.
Yet Elijah represent the youngs. Jordan, you're no longer young. You are now middle-aged.
I'm not.
You're a middle-aged generation.
Middle-aged.
I'm the most elderly man Gen Z possible, though.
That's me and millennial. That's why I always claim Gen X because I'm.
He's not. He's on the border.
Year.
Well, no, I just mean in mannerism. Like I've been like an 87-year-old, Jewish man.
You complain about your sciatica all the time.
No, precisely, exactly. Anyway,
that's because you're a Jew from Yonkers.
Yes, precisely, exactly. No, so I've been raised with certain attitudes, mannerisms, and it's the reason I can't really speak for my generation. But to speak for my generation, if you look at the exit polling, which is always very suspect, it suggests that 18 to 29-year-olds went Democratic by 50 to 60 points.
Yeah.
And that's pretty astonishing. That's not true in other countries. That's an American phenomenon.
Right. Actually, the right wing is actually in Europe is actually where a lot of the youth are right now. But I will say, however, when Gen Zers are right wing, holy shit, are they right wing?
Yeah, well, they're all radical. First of all, the ones who make it in terms of right wing circles are ones from elite schools. And as there's fewer and fewer people to inherit this Reaganite lunatic apparatus, they get more and more attention and more money and radicalize one another, basically off of seeing libs of TikTok posting. Or the fact that there's weird clubs that are pole dancing on campus, right? And they're like, this is the end of America. And so they're activated by peculiar issues which instill in them an extremely right-wing attitude, which translates to extremely right-wing politics. And because of Generation
Z is bringing LaRoucheism back, for example.
Right.
In New York,
someone should tell them though, this is your time to have sex. It stops.
Yeah.
No, his generation doesn't have sex.
I know this is their opportunity. Stop talking politics for a second. Go get laid.
Yeah. Anyway, actually, in terms of LaRoucheites, there in New York State, there was a LaRoucheite nominee for Senate, which was completely hilarious. And people were like, this is fraudulent. There were 60,000 signatures for the LaRoucheite to get on the ballot and only 30,000 votes. But people just wander around signing things, frankly.
I'm disappointed.
I had a job for a while with the city council president I mentioned before, where he lost a municipal election. I forget which one of many. And his job was to go around to one of the many, small parties we have in New York to get Andrew Cuomo nominated as the candidate for the Women's Equality Party. So I could very much see a similar thing happening with these LaRoucheites, where it's just a bunch of Republicans who are I know LaRouche, sort of, I've heard the name. We're just going to get this person on the ballot and see if it can snap up some tasty, votes of fools.
I was with the return of the LaRoucheites, I'm hoping at one point people, these Gen Z kids see the light in the way and find out about the RevComs. You get a bunch of like supporting Avakian thought on campus again.
No, Jeremy, do not bring back the new left just for fucking laugh. Like,
but he's still out there. I think he's living in prison. He's not living in prison. No, living in Paris.
He lives in France, not prison.
Yeah.
Paris, not prison. Like,
depending on
coward. Couldn't go down like a Black Panther. All right. Anyway,
I'm seeing in the chat a lot of people saying there's a Gen Z right-wing uptick. I don't think there's a Gen Z right-wing uptick. There's highly connected groups of online people, and there's a ability to navigate online for a lot of young people, but not all of us. And these two things translate to being able to see some crazies.
It seems like there's an uptick, in other words, because of the internet and social media.
Yeah, but I don't know if there is. I know that there's, look, we're not the boomers, Well,
the thing is, boomers have always been more conservative than media portrayals, but they're also less conservative than Gen Xers.
Yeah.
And look, I push back on people like, well, age generational gaps don't matter. Actually, in the case of the United States, it really does, because generational maps onto housing ownership so significantly.
Mm-hmm.
And that the U.S. baby boomers were, as a whole, the last beneficiaries of the Great Social Compact, where the U.S. squandered in a decade and a half, like 60% of the world's wealth. But it wasn't destroyed in World War II, actually. I actually point out that they didn't even take it. It was just we were the last people with money standing.
Yeah.
And we had a bunch of factories that we'd built up to pump out war material, and like, hey, well, we might as well do something with this. Like, Willow Run still exists, so let's do something with that.
Yeah, I also think though wealth inequality amongst Gen Zers is unreal. It's also really heavy amongst Gen Xers. Millennials. Millennials have been conservatizing in social attitudes, although they haven't been abandoning the Democratic Party for the most part, which I find kind of interesting. And it's particularly college-educated people of color, like it's that specific, where you see an abandonment of progressive attitudes and an abandonment of social democratic attitudes in the last 5 years, but you don't see an abandonment of the Democratic Party.
Well, they don't see any change in economic policy with the Democrats that makes them fear for their taxes anymore.
So
there's no difference.
Right. I mean, and no one really wants, I mean, we have this nightmare scenario where if the most reactionary parts of the Christian nationalist world actually won, you would not just have a return to 1985, but you'd have a turn to 1985, however, with a registry list owned by the government with every person who has a deviant relationship listed explicitly because it was legal. And in that scenario, it's not just a step back, it's a step worse, because the other thing that you couldn't happen in the 1980s, in the 70s, it was really, even though homosexuality was formally illegal, it's actually really hard to do anything with it except to add it as an additional charge to like aggravated sodomy. Are to get people on public sex acts in bathhouses. That was like it. Because we didn't have stuff like this. All right. Now, however, they can monitor that shit. And so it really would be the hellscape that a lot of leftists are afraid of.
It's almost, you just say, a 1985 with a list of like deviant X's, very, very, very like classic Alan Moore comic.
They publish your rice purity score and execute everybody above and below a certain number.
Above as well. I like that. You're too pure. We can't trust you. Inhuman.
This is
it's not good, folks. Yeah, it's dark.
So I do think there's a real sense to that. I also think there's a lot of people talking about there's about to be an intergenerational transfer because the silent generation and the baby boomers are beginning to die. And Gen X is way more reactionary than And actually, this I also want to put in a historical example of, because yes, class really matters here, but Gen X is actually the generation that really did do worse than the prior generations first. It wasn't millennials, despite the fact that journalists say it, because journalists are fucking dumb.
Also, millennials are the current prime targeting advertising markets, like Gen X was 25 years earlier. But yeah, go on.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
But there has already been, I think some of the sorting there has already been, the generational wealth transfers to Gen Xers finally happened during COVID. And so we've seen a lot of both material reasons why there's been a shift in this. And they see how precarious it is. I'm going to talk about a topic that I do in a special, and so I'm not going to focus a lot of it. I'm doing a 10-minute special on this on Friday, and that's the Carl Bajir, who I think in my video I call Carl Bajir, because I have no idea when people adopt pen names if they go by the American or German.
Bajir's way cooler.
It is.
Well, I'm from, again, I will say this. I'm the one Michigan Gen Xer. Sorry, I missed the earlier talk. And not only am I drinking Faygo tonight because I found a place in Portland that stocks Faygo, but we do have spelled the same way, but Meyer, or in this case, Carl Bayer.
So Bayer,
yeah,
lame.
What flavor is Faygo? I'm confused.
Faygo is any sort of flavor. I'm drinking the cream soda, spelled CREME, because it legally does not have actual cream in it.
Faygo is what the Rust Belt gaslights itself with. Because it's objectively not good. Just like RC Cola is also objectively not good.
I was going to ask in relation to RC Cola on that spectrum.
RC Cola is at least...
Faygo?
RC Cola is at least available in like every restaurant you go into, because it's what they serve. It's RC Cola syrup is a lot cheaper than Coca-Cola syrup. So you
I have like 3 drinks here.
Yeah,
I have a nice half-liter bottle of Mexican Coke with cane sugar in it.
Wow, this late at night, there. That's you can have caffeine this late. Jesus,
I also have wine, so
okay.
It balances out. It's fine.
I drink caffeine until 3 a.m.
Yeah.
If I drink it after noon, it's like I'm already a bad enough insomniac that I can't sleep. But
I have to be up for Saharias tomorrow morning, so I can.
So Elijah's got to make minion. So okay. For the 2 Goya amongst us and all of our Goya audience, I apologize for how Jewy the conversation's getting.
No way. You're from now on. You're Eliyahu. And you are Yirmiyahu, and I'm just gonna have to go with Michael because I don't know what JG stands for. But
really good.
Yeah.
Although I have the most Goyish name, so there's just that.
Varnishkus.
One topic I did want to hit before things get even sillier is, let's do a faction definition.
I was going to talk about that. This is what we're going to go.
Good call. Go ahead. Sorry. In the comments, Cheerwine is coming up.
Cheerwine's good.
Cheerwine is good. Yeah, I can't get it in Portland, but it's good.
Cheerwine is amazing. Okay.
It's an East Coast. It comes out of the South. It actually used to be distributed. Same with RC Cola. And look, I don't want to betray my regional roots. I actually think like all of it's crap. I miss going into a store and having 85 different kinds of weird grain water like I used to have in Korea.
Yeah.
Because drinking stuff that tastes like corn silk and pain is probably the best way to go. But here we go. So the factions. I have started calling the Democratic Socialists Social Democrats again, because I always thought they should have been called that anyway, and because I think increasingly they don't really have an alternative vision to at least the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And
what do you think that is?
Bernie.
Or out of practice, but yeah.
No, I don't think it's just out of practice. I think a lot of what we see that's very online, like we talked about these weird LaRoucheite Gen Zers and other scary people in Gen Z, which I would probably agree is like 1/10 of Gen Z. It's just a very connected and insane tenth. One thing I would say is I would think that we have to really start parsing out the factions, because the Social Democrats have been the losers since the Bernie scenario. They don't have a vision right now. And increasingly, their vision isn't that different from any progressive Democrat. And what I was going to mention with the Carl Bayer is the argument that he made, which is actually very close to an argument made by Doug Henwood about a year ago on the Great Resignation not applying to blue states, except we're not going to talk about California. We're going to shut up about that. The biggest blue state. We also had issues with them trying to rebrand the Democratic Party as a party of the working class because of its because poor people tend to vote Democratic. And they were right. Carl Bayer was actually right about the Republicans. So this is one of the things that I've often seen, where you're being honest about your enemies, but statistically dishonest about yourself. So there is a truth that if you make over $100,000 a year, you are something like 65% more likely to be Republican. But if you actually break down the sub demographics in that, if you make over $500,000 a year, in fact, if you make over $250,000 a year, you statistically flip back and likely to be a Democrat. It's just there's a lot of the wealth is in the upper middle class range, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because there's just more of them.
That's also a regional bifurcation.
Yes, it is. Region is more predictive than specific class and whether or not you petite bourgeois. So it seems like a lot of the winning factions of the bourgeois, of the actual capitalist, actually do favor the Democrats now. That has kind of been sort of changing in tech, which is bifurcating from its traditional Democratic loyalty. Nurse John is coming on. So we have the anarchist rep to tell the Social Democrats to suck it.
Real quick, just for a quick little citation, for those who don't know, we are referring to a thing that Carl Bayer posted on his Substack today. Democrats won the working class, Republicans won the less educated, posted, according to my phone, 10 hours ago.
Yeah. And I responded to it within 2 hours because it made me mad. But to defend Carl, his stats were based off of stats commonly cited by Democrats, and don't go into other stats commonly cited by Republicans. So what Republicans will do is they'll bring up the number that I just brought up, saying that Democrats are the party of the rich, because there is a real sense, and this PMC thesis, which a lot of social democrats have promoted for the past 2 years, plays into this. This idea that there's a whole lot of professional managerial support for the Democratic Party, and it turns out that, well, you have to separate professionals from management on this, and you have to look at regions. And in many ways, in so much that the working class votes, it votes largely in line with whatever the dominant economic force in its region is. And also, even in high turnout years, it still doesn't vote that much, which is an interesting phenomenon. Now, that is also defining working class by the way liberals define working class, which is something Carl's rightly pushing back on. There has been a tendency since the 1980s, he says it's a right-wing conspiracy, I think it's a long sociological trend, to use education as a proxy for class. Because historically speaking, it kind of was until the middle 1990s, right?
Until the Gen Xers all graduated from college.
Right.
And it dropped out. That's I will say as one of the few Gen Xers on the panel, I do remember. In fact, even like Courtney Love would talk about it in interviews about how Gen X was the first the first generation to see worse outcomes than their parents, and damn, she wasn't right. But I think before we spin off too much into the Bayer's posting directly, first, hi John, and second is do you want to do a quick faction rundown first? Or do you want to talk more? You want to finish up on your Bayer?
I want to finish on Bayer because I'm doing a whole show on that, and I don't want to postpone it. So, Bayer's breakdown of the statistics actually also doesn't deal with what we're about to deal with. There's factions of Democrats both regionally and sectorally, and ideologically, and that the only way you can claim that Democrats aren't disproportionately of the upper rich, so let's say not the 1%. We don't know that much about the demographics of the actual super rich, but of the 2%, Democrat is the party of 65% of them, and that's largely regionally based. So let's actually go into this faction thing. I find it interesting right now because I, on one hand, have been pushing back on the notion commonly believed by most everybody that we're seeing a renaissance of unionization. I do, however, think we're seeing a renaissance of new unionization, and that has conflated a whole lot of talk about these different factions on the liberal side. Also, conversely, the factions on the conservative side have been misrepresented by liberals. So, for example, a year ago, there's this talk in which evangelicals were becoming culturally dominant. And I remember Gloria Steinem, of all people, which I was surprised she was still alive, going on to the BBC, talking about how we've seen a rise of the evangelical right. And I'm like, no, you haven't. That's actually
haven't their
not
numbers
true.
Been dropping?
Yes. Dramatically in the last 15 years.
Not only have their numbers been dropping, but they're becoming more and more isolated culturally. And it seems like one of the things I was talking with my coworkers today, one of the reasons why I didn't hop on the call earlier, so I'm fucking exhausted after 12 hours at the hospital, is that a lot of my coworkers were of the opinion that the repeal of Roe v. Wade was kind of like the sop to a constituency of the of the Republican base that just doesn't have the reach that it used to, and it really motivated people to vote that were otherwise voting. Like in our state, in Illinois, we had a very, very wildly far out Trump endorsed candidate for governor, and he just got his ass kicked. And he was very, very pro-life was one of his major talking points. So yeah, I just don't see. It seems like it's that part of. I think there's a lot of fear on the left of the Republicans rising or this reactionary tide, but the right seems about as politically exhausted as the left does. They just have oligarch money, so it doesn't seem that way.
I will say
this. I was going to say, wasn't there also big pushback in, of all places, Kentucky against
yes,
in Kansas?
Well, in I forget which state, but it's one of these southern ones. The Religious Freedom Amendment is currently losing in Louisiana or Mississippi or something. It's amendment to guarantee religious freedom, and it's just by the narrowest of margins losing. So if you look at the referenda, it says a very different, or it doesn't say a very different thing in my opinion, but it says something consistent with a lot of the electoral results, which is that people are very annoyed at the overreach on the part of conservative Christians.
I mean, I pointed out in one hand, there are people who would love to put LGBT people in the camps. There's the 30% of the population that was bigoted, didn't go away, it just got quiet. That's true. But the assumption that most people under 50 were just going to tolerate that amongst a lot of leftists actually blew my mind, because I'm on one hand, you're claiming to represent democracy, and on the other hand, you don't trust people when even you have evidence to the contrary. And I'm going to be honest. I do think this is cynical on the Democrats' part because they also don't have a vision right now, except for they have coherence only in opposing the removal of civil rights, which is saving their ass.
Well, one kind of I don't know, social media question for this is I'm kind of curious about because something actually of all people it was it was seeing Christopher Hedges at one of his book events at Powell's back in I don't know, like 13 years ago or something. But he mentioned I think this is when he was touring for his book about how he doesn't what is it? It's like his I don't believe in atheists book, but he was talking about how because perception, heavily media fueled perceptions of like religious people kind of only narrowed down in like the late 70s and especially in the end of the 80s moral majority era just to be the real wackos, because like once you hit the 60s and kind of regular people talking about being like church attending and everything kind of like went away. So it's kind of like the only people who were left to do this thing who were represented in media were the kind were the fundy types. And so I'm wondering how much of that is still because they still get a lot of they are overrepresented in the media that a lot of people use to base their ideas about the world. And it's kind of a thing where like it's this completely like perspective skewing thing.
Well, in the 80s and 90s, well, even in the 70s, like in the 70s, you're talking about people who actually controlled like satellite radio stations and shit and had real cultural capital. And in places like the Southeast, they did have like, I remember people like my mom who was, religiously confused former Catholic who converted to Judaism and then converted back, but like was like watching the 700 Club because that's what you did in the 1980s in the South.
That's what my dad was in.
When people talk about secularization and Hedges, I mean, like Hedges is interesting because Hedges is right that the media misrepresented what evangelicals were. I mean, the evangelical vote before the 1970s was largely spectrumy, and I've pointed out many times that like William James Bryant was a fucking fundamentalist, but he was a progressive. But that sorted itself out not just in the United States. So pretending that that's just the media seems to be a little bit of a cope for me, because this also happened in other countries.
I mean,
where
Shas was the swing vote in Israel for most of, I think, the first like 2/3 of the country's existence, and now they are certainly not a swing vote. Let's say.
Right. I mean, although Israel's a particular case because basically any secular Jew with a half a mind who's not in Tel Aviv has gotten the fuck out. So, but in general, we don't see that anymore. And even one of the things that I've been pointing out to people, I get pushback on this because I was talking about the Europeization of the American right, that you're basically dealing with oligarchs trying to argue for explicit privilege, and sometimes they'll make populist appeals effectively, but that they don't really have their own ideology anymore. And that has not been true in the U.S. 70s, 80s, and 90s. In the 70s, 80s, and 90s, all of the formal political establishment was responding to movement conservatism. Period. That was true for the Democrats. That was what they did. All right. Like, particularly got worse after the fall of the Soviet Union. But movement conservatism drove the dialogue. After its seeming consolidation of power after 9/11, it was kind of very quickly proven to be emotionally exhausted, and that its coalition didn't really make sense. Neoconservatives who are basically okay with democratic social welfare reforms, light and privatized, but we're they're fine with Fordism as long as you're quiet about it, as long as we can blow up all these brown countries.
Military industrial Fordism.
Right, military industrial Fordism. Yeah, exactly. They're okay with that. In a coalition with evangelicals who only care about cultural issues and don't really have a coherent economic policy at all. Militia people and libertarians who a friend of mine was like, well, we're going to see a rebirth of libertarianism because all the anti-free market people lost with the Trumpists in this round. And I'm like, oh, that's so funny.
Speaking of the free market libertarian thing, Charlie, apparently there was, what was it? Was it Ben Burgess talking about his his debate with Charlie Kirk, and Charlie Kirk was making all this hay about government spending and like how terrible this was. And this is socialism, right? Government spending is socialism. And it really feels like the whole idea of government spending as being like this thing that people are concerned about is really deflated. People are concerned about inflation, right? But that's because inflation hits them in the pocketbook. I don't think anyone gives a fuck about like government spending anymore. I think over the past 10 years, it's just like between from Bush until today, like we've just watched the government just print money, spend money. And fundamentally, it really, I mean, like I was talking with some coworkers about how it's like, things like inflation isn't apocalyptic right now. Like it sucks. It's not terrible.
We're not Britain now.
You can buy a used car and it's not like fucking like expensive. And I think that we're getting to the point where millennials are becoming the largest voting bloc. And I think millennials are looking at like, can I buy any car, not a new car? Can I just make sure that I can make sure my refrigerator is full? And so far that seems to be the case. Like the CEOs of various grocery corporations, companies that sell retail groceries are like, well, we're raising the prices and people keep being able to buy and afford it. We haven't hit a price ceiling yet, so we're just going to keep it this way. That doesn't mean it's great, but for people, 45 and younger, when has it ever been good, right?
Yeah, I think this is where we need to really settle down, because a lot of people were telling me this isn't about the economic markets, and I'm like, well, it kind of is. One, abortion with the cost of childcare is an economic issue. That's actually probably why a lot of people care, honestly.
No doubt. Yeah.
I know too many women in Utah have to leave the labor market entirely because the cost of childcare is more than a middle class wage. Two, and another key point to point out on people, it has been known that what the Fed is trying to do and what the Republicans are dipping down on is what they want to do is fight inflation by creating massive unemployment. And given that we have a declining population, that's going to be bigger and more unemployment than even they expect. And I think the average person actually does get that. That you're basically being told inflation are jobs, and people are wisely choosing jobs. All right. Now, is that calculus may change by 2024 because the Democrats are doing something that I think is fundamentally mistaken, which is they're trying to run again, like they did with Obama, on fiscal responsibility and pick up conservative talking points. That they're the real party of fiscal responsibility. Now, I actually have a problem with our loose money decade, but only because it was mostly aimed at the rich. Right. My problem is not fundamentally that I think the monetary supply is even the primary driver of inflation, because I don't think that. I do think it has an effect, but not that much of one. I'm not an MMTer, but I do think they have some valid points on this. And there is a truth that every time the Democrats have argued that they need to run on balancing the budget again, they've actually contracted the economy by limiting the money supply in strategic areas, mostly hitting the poor.
I don't know if they're primarily running on fiscal conservatism, though.
That's how Biden is framing it tonight. I don't think that's how they ran this week, but that is how this is being sold.
Biden occasionally will tweet out, he's like, folks, we have closed the deficit. It doesn't exist anymore, folks. But it's not it's not like a major talking point for any successful sectors of the Democratic Party at this point. It's hanging on in the Inflation Reduction Act because it's like the Manchin presidency, and Joe Manchin, is like, he's a fiscal conservative, but the party itself is much less willing to play ball with fiscal conservatism. And you see this in the fact that they're willing to deficit spend pretty dramatically.
Actually, I will say for the first time, actually, in the last 3 election rounds, they are willing to deficit.
It feels like lip service. It feels like lip service.
It's $4 trillion of spending or something. It's an enormous amount of money. It's not that they're bragging about spending, but I think that the deficit stuff is lip service. I actually don't think it has that much, that much cred at the national level.
However, we will see, for example, if stuff like we've already seen, for legal reasons, Biden take a more and more conservative approach to his already compromised student loan forgiveness to try to avoid a lawsuit that's likely to go through and undo a lot of it, if not most of it.
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting because there is a battle between the fiscal end of the party and the actual politicians on this. I mean, I do like to remind people Larry Salmon is a Democrat. It's interesting because you are also not seeing them adopt modern monetary theory. That's really, honestly, modern monetary theory as a point of policy has really been something that Republicans do more and always have done more. But mostly, again, to give tax cuts to the rich. That's kind of what they do. And occasionally subsidize that with regressive tax cuts on the state level because states don't have currency sovereignty. And so one of the ironies is a lot of conservative states, particularly in the South, have actually pretty high tax rates when you look at their sales tax and their income tax together. That's not always true. So there's that issue. I don't think when we come to now, we have to talk about the factions of the sides. Do you want me to start with the Democrats or the Republicans? Because the Republicans are actually more opaque right now. They've been held together by a Bonapartist devotion to Trump. That's been repudiated now. And I do have to think we're going to have to do a lot of soul searching about why the Democrats were so wrong on this. Because most Democrats I know really thought that they were about to be overrun by Trumpists. And most leftists I know also said the same thing. Now, they're not saying it right now, but I don't know if they were being cynical.
Resist libs have the mandate of heaven. That's what it is.
I was going to say, you yourself or somebody else mentioned that, we really, and actually this is also something that guys like George Lakoff has written for 20 years is non-conservatives need a far better model of how conservatives actually think. Because right now that it's kind of like each side think. Well, it's like it's almost at a certain point. There's the amount of projection that goes on, or clueless projection that goes on. It's like they just act like we do or something.
One of the interesting things that I think is interesting when you look at historical studies, and this is one thing that Arnold Schroeder over at Felt Like an Animal is actually good on, but not entirely. He hasn't entirely squared the circle, the two things he sees. One hand, he actually notices that temperaments and conservative temperaments are based on region and are based on age and are based on certain kind of things that have to do with just the way you're inclined, even maybe biologically. However, he also notices that at different times, socialists and other kinds of leftists have made appeals to these kinds of people. All right. And what he says now is we become so addicted to framing as a subject of politics more than reframing. And one of the things that I used to critique Lakoff on is I think Lakoff is partly guilty of this too. But Lakoff has a point that if you were to sell, I've always pointed out that while you can get California to enshrine abortion in its constitution, you can't get it to, like, for example, really stand up on workers' rights in a prop. You just can't. Whereas you actually can in Florida or Utah, but it will be immediately gutted by the Republican Congress and Senate of the state.
Real quick, can you mention just for a term thing? Can you talk about the framing versus reframing distinction?
So framing is people who are obsessed with framing think that the reframing is not the point here. People obsessed with framing think the message and the substance of the politics must be the same. So, for example, you would not take a conservative sounding framework you wouldn't talk about strength as opposed to peace. All right. Because to change the framing is to change something fundamental about politics because the personal is political, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think this is fundamentally wrong. And I think it actually misunderstands the way people are inclined to think. And it also shows a very limited model of mind. And on this, I do think progressives in particular and social democrats as an adjunct to that tend to come from a very specific social class. The rumors of us being downwardly mobile former professionals is mostly true. Like, it's mostly true. You know, it's a stereotype for a reason. And we don't really know how to interact or code switch with people anymore.
Let's be clear though, Varn. Like, that's maybe an American affliction. I was just listening to like a 3-part series on Lula down in Brazil, and Lula is very good at reading the room. Whatever you're gonna say about him, and this is like a fundamental political skill, is being able to listen to people and hear where they're coming from, and then tailor your message to appeal to them. And
Lula is the best Brazilian politician in 120 years. Like, even though I don't like his policies, and that's why.
Yeah,
like,
right.
He can sell anything to anybody, which is kind of terrifying to me in some ways. But
we need more gravelly voices in politics talking about beer and barbecue.
I don't think it's that. I mean, one of the reasons why I think it worries me is because Lula is fundamentally constrained by his coalition and the fact his party is actually collapsing in front of him, but he is doing fine.
He's doing great.
the Workers' Party is not doing great.
Right.
But we're not talking about Brazilian politics. I do think you're right, except John, I've seen that the distinction between American politics and, say, Canadian or British or European politics is actually lessening over time, not increasing.
Sure. And, like, I'm not saying that this is like some fundamental distinction between American politics and everywhere else. I'm just saying that the American left seems to be particularly afflicted with trouble being able to grasp how to sell their policies or their politics to people who they maybe like have some temperamental differences with. And this comes down to like this is a thing we run into as a union steward. Like, how do I frame what we're doing in the union to people who like otherwise wouldn't be inclined? And you have to do that work to be successful in building like union power, or else people just won't fucking like engage. And you can't only be talking to your base. And that's actually a thing that I have to push back on inside my own union, is that there's always a reflex of like, well, those people aren't for the union, so why the fuck aren't you getting them onto your side? And that's just like it's a problem. Like, and it's a mentality that it's better to write people off than it is to like engage with them. That doesn't mean you engage with everybody, but you certainly engage with like just about everybody. And
So, for example, I like to bring up the pronoun issue because it's an issue where the right actually tends to get a lot of hay, where people get afraid of annoying pronoun declarations at work. It's a real thing, real happens, and they start listening to Ben Shapiro, and then they get bait and switch Matt Welsh, right? The thing is, most people, if you start off showing them Matt Welsh before they've had the slow like frog in the water
Boiling.
framing shift are terrified by the Matt Welsh proposition. They really are.
I've personally seen that happen to people in my family, where if you introduce them to Matt Walsh after they've been dabbling in some of this stuff, they're like horrified by it.
Right. So if you inject that faster, you can get there. And for me, that's what got me out of the right. Like, I started seeing scary shit in the paleo conservative right. And really scary stuff, and it pushed me away. Like, I started seeing Joe Sobran complain about the international Jew. And but I was being slow boiled in that
Cringe.
stew. Yeah, in that stew.
Derek's like, that's me.
Yeah, I'm half international Jew here. So that's a problem. I have gotten pushback on stuff actually from both sides when I say stuff like, hey, when you're talking to a large group of people, you cannot throw, say, said group under the bus, usually trans people, frankly, right now, but you don't have to also use the same language you use when talking to trans activists, right? You can say people, for example, as opposed to people who have children, or as opposed to gendered language, right? And it doesn't strike anyone as weird. They won't even notice you're doing it. Right. Similarly, I say Latin, which I wish more people would do, as opposed to saying Latinx, which is weird, or saying or gendering the term most of the time. All right. This is a framing choice, and it's a framing to be as inclusive as possible. Does that mean that there aren't still going to be reactionaries in your midst on these social issues? Absolutely, there will be, but you're going to be defanging them in a lot of ways, and the really reactionary ones will show themselves, and then they really are a problem.
Sure.
It's I'm reminded of the what was it? Actually, what was it? Like I can't remember. A bunch of things I've read about talk about how one of the best, strongest anti-racism measures that you can take as a group of people is a union struggle, which is both gets now, but also, I mean, because interwar leftist history is a popular topic on here, and when it was the CPUSA, the Communist Party of the USA, was the one who finally twigged to the fact that, okay, wait a minute, we need to have like black people in our group too, because just for
where do we find them though?
Yeah, because of the other shirt making. But no, but oddly enough, I just think of, because of all people, I'm reminded of something, an organizing question that of all people, Amber Ailey Frost talked about getting asked. She said that somebody asked her, it's like, well, what happens when you have racists in your union though? And her response was something, well, you're on the way of winning. Right. At least getting people to, even though they have, people who have these, like, still have these interpersonal, might still have like some interpersonal bigoted tendency, whatever you want to call it, will still kind of, at a certain point move past that. And this is actually something I wanted to suggest to Jason and Pascal as this is Rev's subject, is at one point talking about the evolution of kind of like a certain kind of like post-war thinking about racism that like upper middle class people started thinking about as like this kind of like disconnected moral, almost like there was an issue of like just you'd have like the bad soul particles afflicting you, and that overrode everything else. But anyway,
I think one thing about to return to the elections for just a moment is that the centrality of people being just like pissed off at wokeness really is not apparent anywhere except Florida. So Florida's the big.
Well, I actually would disagree with you. It's pretty fucking apparent on school board issues.
Okay, I'll say for national races,
right? But it doesn't measure up. This is one of the things that I want to talk about: split ticket balloting. Like people aren't concerned about it on the national level.
There was this. I was reading American Affairs, and there was this like article on like the different realignment by I think Julius Krein, and he had this one line which stuck with me, which is like, you can just get the Democrats if you just ask them, what is a woman? And like, that's the dumbest thing ever. You know, like you're on stage, you ask the other person, what is a woman? This doesn't stand out to people as like, oh my gosh, you know, his opponent is such a woke loser. It's like, you're running for office. No, I want to hear your opinion on substantial issues. I actually think that the midterms showed that the American public is not as reactionary as a lot of people assumed, at least in the way it thinks about itself.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. I like what I know there was a professor at George Washington University that he sort of summed up the election saying, you know, the red wave began and ended in Florida, which seems very true. And that's what's interesting to me about DeSantis's win, because I mean, everyone's looking at him as like being the guy that runs in 2024, right? You know,
now that Trumpism's been kind of repudiated by his candidates losing.
Yeah, but what's weird is I don't know how would DeSantis do in a national election? You know, I'm not sure.
I don't think there's a there there.
Yeah,
that's the problem with DeSantis and like the entire Republican Party. I mean, all of politics in America right now, the entire political class is running on empty.
Yeah,
the right is running on empty. The left is running on empty. The center is running on empty. It's just the center has the money, like keeping it going. I mean, I like when I see like people talking about Trump versus DeSantis, I see them eating each other in the next 2 years, and Biden winning an extra another 4 years.
Yeah, I think that's the kicker is that a lot. I think I'm just reminded of like the waves of candidates of GOP candidates in 2012 and 2016, that there is kind of a self-selecting kind of inaccuracy going on, where your current commentariat are people who are disconnected enough, or ensconced in this very weird, sludgy, like weird system where the only people they can kind of pick as to who will emerge is kind of like it's so just massive epistemological issues where they won't be able to tell who can emerge in that. It's like nobody can who could figure that Trump would have been this this weird game show candidate who would be the one person who could prove how bad the Clinton campaign was. Because I think there's one of the hindsight bits or the survivorship bias problems is that people always talk about how did Trump win without talking about how did the person who ran against him lose, and like that doesn't that's not going to be around the next time. And so having this really famous like reactionary type is not going against a Clinton campaign.
So to kind of both put a kibosh on this discussion and talk about the fucking factions, because that's what you guys wanted me to talk about, but also to push back on this a little bit, not what John says, because I think John's actually right. One of the problems we're going to have defining these factions is they're exhausted. And one of the interesting things that I've been pointing out is the newest faction on the American political scene is the Democratic Socialists / Social Democrats. I'm going to call them by their true name, put the adverb and adjective in the right order. And yes, they are insult to the historical pre-1920 Social Democrats, but so is everybody. So I want to say that what we've seen, even in union politics, and this is why this unionization thing has been so hard to talk about, is that the existing unions are also exhausted. They are. They're not growing. They lost during COVID and had not made gains. All the new growth is in new unions, and they're hitting walls too. But there really is a call for it again. There's been a call for it since 2010, really. But the novelty of the already existing unions has run off, and particularly what they did during COVID, which was jacking shit. With the exception of the nurses union.
And Jack left town.
Right. So let's talk about the factions. In the Democratic Party, I think you have, the factions identified by the Pew poll actually does kind of hold. You have an identitarian faction, which is really loud and obnoxious and well-funded, but nobody likes them. Including the center of the Democratic Party, which will deploy them like strategically, but then also as soon as they can move back to their old center, they'll immediately do so. You have the progressives, which are the least popular group in American politics, in the way they are perceived, but whose policies are broadly popular. This contradiction is not new. This has been true since the 70s. That everyone hates progressives, but most people kind of like their policies. I mean, really. And one of the reasons why I think people underestimate the hatred of the progressives is they never achieve their policies, ever. We have the Social Democratic faction, which, while larger than anything on the former socialist left and forever, is still a tiny percentage of the electorate from what we can tell. And thus, to bulk up its numbers in a game theoretic fashion has made concessions to both populist and progressives, losing its distinctive identity, which is, I think, why I was bringing up the Carl Bayer thing, is that's what I think is going on there. Like, it's not that Bayer wants to be a stooge of the Democrats. It's not even that he's bought off. I mean, I wish we were bought off, man. It's that
where's the money?
Bayer's actually just pulling from like NBC sources for one thing. The error he makes is actually not in is actually consistent with the sources he's using. He just doesn't seem to want to go very much deeper with that. And so to even blame him, and like I know, like I don't know the guy, but I've like had private conversations with him. And defended him in the past, but on this, I think he's like kind of wrong, but also within the purview of a natural logic within the being stuck as an internal opposition within the Democratic Party, whose major figurehead lost and whose plan, let's be frank, was always circular. I'm sorry, but propping Bernie to build the workers' movement that requires the workers' movement to win never made any fucking sense. It was always a self-justifying cope, and I've never been happy with it. And my fear was that we would prop up the center because there'd be nowhere else to go. Because where I agree with Elijah is the American public is not nearly as reactionary as portrayed. It doesn't think in the way that leftist academics and media figures in the very online think, but it also is not fundamentally racialist or anything like that, except in very specific areas. And in even areas where it has been historically true, Georgia, you see a weakening of that racialism.
You're having racial depolarization, in fact, is
Right.
like a big theme of these elections. I mean, you have a Democratic governor of Kansas, right? This is a result in part of the fact that the parties are no longer as racialist, which is part of a bipartisan consensus that racism is bad, even though, there's still differing definitions of what that constitutes.
What is interesting is that's actually led like racialists to move from speaking in code, where they thought it could actually convince people in a slightly more racialized society, speaking in code was useful, to being outright. And, remember when like racialists used to talk about human biodiversity and not like ethnic cleansing? I do. But ironically, that had a pull in a more racist society that was transitioning. Which is not to say we're in a post-racial world. We're absolutely not. But everybody
Too
knows
much
that.
pull for that. We're not ready for that yet. We need our races in the meantime. Super important.
The other thing is the concentration of wealth into like New York and California has been spread out for good and ill, mostly for ill. But for the Democratic voting prospects, it's complicated things. The Democratic voting bloc, as I've been saying, is the poor and the almost super rich. Right? That's its bloc. Right? The Republican voting bloc is the moderately rich and the petite bourgeoisie who are losing. And it is interesting, and Republicans always do a bait and switch about this. They are more represented in the poorer parts of the country. But you'll notice they say Republican districts tend to be poorer. And they're right about that. But what they don't say is that doesn't reflect the voting population at all.
Right.
I mean, I will say, Derick, that, I work with a lot of liberals, a lot of liberal nurses who are Democrats, and they're not rich, right?
Right.
And and I think that there's the professional strata, as they're separate from the managerial strata, is definitely they in my experience, and I have family in Indiana, family in Illinois, folks that are not in like super liberal areas, and there tends to be this this professional strata that also leans Democrat. And I think it's like the NPR moms. That was my mom. My mom was a nurse, and she listened to NPR. She grew up, she was the daughter of a union trucker, and her mom eventually became a nurse after she had 11 kids.
Yeah. My mom now listens to NPR, and she used to be a nurse, although now she's lumping. So
right. So I think that there's it's like the base of any town that has enough people to support an NPR franchise has, and I wish I was making that up, because NPR is, to me at this point, it's like scratching your nails across the chalkboard.
No, it hurts me. Yeah, I have a theory about that, like how NPR's actually moved right wing as the NPR moms have become a bigger thing. But it's good on cultural issues, I guess, because it's like how to talk to your racist uncle about pronouns without triggering him. Also, we should support Raytheon.
Yeah, I will fully cop to being like a full on NPR progressive forever, because when I got to Ann Arbor and I had my headphones on, now I have earbuds in my head all day, but before, when I had headphones on my head all the day, I would kind of stomp around listening to the local campus NPR station and did that even when I moved out here. And Oregon has its own kind of flavor of it, but I think it was finally until about 06 or it was summer of 07 when I finally just couldn't take it anymore, because of I think they're the house style and just idly having American Enterprise Institute commentators on without kind of giving the background for them was just the kind of no, I gotta bail out. So.
Yeah.
The marketplace and listening to them basically giving allegations of enhanced interrogation sort of shit.
Yeah.
I mean, so then if we're talking Democratic factions and we're talking about the NPR mom type people or the NPR grandmas at this point, we could probably also talk about the Daily Show. There's just I hate to break it into media consumption, but it feels like there's probably is people who are reading The Onion and I love The Onion. They're fucking awesome now. But it's people who aged out of The Onion and into John Oliver or whatever. That's a whole other people who are just exasperated at how dysfunctional America is. And this is I feel like there's a parallel, and I know this because I also have family in Eastern Europe. Parallels between the American, that demographic of American liberals and liberals in the former Soviet bloc,
right?
Where it's just people just fundamentally exasperated that they're living in a country that's just visibly breaking down,
right? Which is I think we're also seeing that bloc in Europe is just occurring much faster. I've made my points about Europe elsewhere, and that's what we're talking about tonight. So when someone asks if the South Carolina Democratic government ran on a platform of eliminating state income taxes and having 40% Republicans in its cabinet, are the Democrats part of the left? I have a very unfortunate answer for you. The answer is both yes and no, because the left is a relative trait. And I'm not going to pull the left of capital, because there is no socialist country. I know the China stands are going to cry when I say that, but there is no socialist country anymore to be the left communist of, really. We're not to the left of any common term. There's no international communist movement of which we are the left of. So sorry, my left communist friends. I know you disagree with me about that because you believe this is an internal invariant, whatever, but these words are relativistic and they're common use, and we should use it that way. Do I think we should be voting for Democrats? Ideally, no. Actually, I don't. Okay? But I did get tired years and years and years of hearing, well, politics is everywhere but politics. The real movement is always elsewhere. It's not manifested in politics at all, which leads to like a very inconsistent, weird viewpoint of the world where we can moralistically do harm reduction in politics, but everything else but politics is actually political, which is bizarre. So we do have to deal with the fact for most people, and even people who think they are the left, part of the Democratic Party for them is the left. None of them would include that South Carolina guy, but the Democratic coalition also has never, ever in its history made any damn sense. There's
even that old like Will Rogers quote.
Like the Republicans have always been a bourgeois party till very recently, and who knows what they are now, right? The Democrats have been a bourgeois party, a shitty quasi not really labor party, a party of special interest, a party of planters, a party of Dixiecrats and communists, all at the same time. That's its historical legacy. So when we look at the factions now, it makes sense that it's incoherent. You have professional identitarians, you have professional NPR mom people, you have progressives, you have democratic socialists who are tiny, but until 2020, vote hit way above their weight because they did seem to be an organic counter-systemic movement within the Democrats. But their rhetoric now indicates that's over.
I think they have room for growth in like a few municipalities. So like I think we could very easily see a socialist mayor of New York in 10 years.
Yeah, once the gentrifiers get, big, there are enough gentrifiers, you can get anyone elected in New York.
Hey, I mean, we know how to operate, right?
Sorry.
Operating a political machine, okay? And if we displace the people, we do it.
The DSA can be Tammany Hall in New York and can be a major bastion of progressives in LA and the Bay Area.
Yeah,
but that's
nowhere else.
Right?
I do think that there's a limit because of the real estate money and the cops. I think between real estate money, real estate capital, and police, I believe that there's a fundamental limit to how far the democratic socialist type politicians can extend. And they seem to they run into, hard borders once they get outside of very specific neighborhoods. It's happening here in Chicago.
I don't think in New York the cops are like a major impediment, actually. Real estate money definitely is. In Chicago, it's very different. The Chicago Police Department is like basically Hitlerite. Whereas in New York, they're like urbanist, it's a little more relaxed.
Hey, we got some more factions here. All right, you can add those to the list.
There you go.
So factions of voters and now factions of cops.
Well, the LA
as European leaders,
right? I don't know if that's good or bad.
One thing I'm going to say, the other thing that we have to deal with is the rich Democrats who are in LA and the Bay and New York who are law and order Democrats. And we have to deal with, I also think we do have to deal with, there is a professional class, particularly, I mean, I hate to be this specific, but it's largely down to college educated Black women. That has its own interest in the Black Congressional Caucus, which generally overlaps with the progressives, but not always. They make deals with conservatives all the time, right? So we have those factions at least. Example, they literally made sure that to keep the to make sure that the conservatives held Atlanta and the areas outside of Atlanta for longer by a decade, so that those would not be non-Black voting blocks, because there was a fear that they would either be right or some other minority group if you included more of the North Atlanta suburbs in those districts. That and ProPublica broke that in 2011, and there's a memory hole about it, right?
Okay,
and maintaining historically black districts in the Southeast has largely actually been something some Republicans are actually very okay with, because it curtails even moderate Democratic power bases. That is changing, though. But that'll get us down to the other weird faction that we're seeing, which is the suburban soccer moms who are Republicans at the state level, but will vote for Democrats at the national level.
New England.
What's the logic there?
Abortion rights and fear of Trump.
Okay, good answer.
And a lot of these people I know are like are Republicans in the New York City suburbs, and then more broadly, like across New York is not New England, but across New England, they're very different from Republicans anywhere else.
Yeah.
They're all still like Rockefeller Republican types. That's the reason why there's a Republican governor of New Hampshire, of Vermont, and until very recently Massachusetts. They are much more equivalent to like sort of electing like a Bidenist check on a bunch of like Elizabeth Warren progressives, basically.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So it's just a very different local dynamic, but I don't know if that extends to elsewhere in the country.
It extends to like the suburbs of Atlanta, but not to Georgia. So, for example, like the areas that I know everybody was thinking Atlanta and Macon and the mostly black cities for what happened in Georgia in 2020. They always vote Democratic. They've voted Democratic since the 30s. It's not new. It's not a particular demographic shift. That's been a pattern since the second FDR administration. The difference was that the white and well-off immigrant, so Southeast Asian mostly and Arab, suburbs of outside of Atlanta, which used to be sundown towns not even 2 decades ago, okay, swung for the Democrats at the national level for the Senate and for the president, but not at the local level at all. And that's also true, by the way, of the military base cities like Warner Robins, which swung for the Democrats at the national level, but not at the local level at all, which surprised me because I actually miscalled Georgia in 2020 because I didn't figure that like Warner Robins was going to vote blue at the national level, because I thought the military was going to be more loyal to its weird 1/3 wackadoos, because they mostly come from my part of the country. So, but that's not the case, which illustrated my point about the diversity of the military. And like, if there's a military coup in the United States, it's not going to be from Trump. It's going to be from the authoritarian parts of the center. All right. Which I think is probably my most unpopular opinion. But
I don't think they'll need to do it, but I think you're right.
I don't think they need to do it unless like the Democratic fears of Trumpists were absolutely true and they really were able to do a coup. There would be a counter coup from the authoritarian center. They don't want to do it.
I actually think one thing which kneecaps the right is the fact that they genuinely believe in the Burnhamite new class thesis now.
Yes.
Because it leads to them having a completely false understanding of what staffing a government would look like. And so
sorry, real quick. Could you do a quick description of that?
Yeah. So basically, like in the debates over professional managerial stuff, there's 3 broad camps, and Varn can correct me because I'm sure he will have to. One is the Burnhamite camp, which is associated with certain sectors of the right today, and it says there's a new class, like a literal ruling class, in the way capitalists exist, that are the professional managerial class. There's another group which I've come to associate Lash with, which says it's a changing mode of management of the capitalist class. And then there's a third group which says it doesn't exist. And then other people are like somewhere in the middle. And a lot of Republicans nowadays believe in this first theory, where they're saying there's literally a new ruling class. It's professors who we hate and like lower level management and like people who work on Wall Street at low levels.
Yeah, they literally believe in a bourgeoisie-less society, and they believe society is run by a dominant class in the center of society, which literally doesn't make any fucking sense.
It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, the aforementioned woke capital. Also, thank you for the explanation.
Yeah, exactly. Woke capital. I think it's woke capital at all levels, everywhere. And I was, for a long time, I thought like, oh man, this is a rhetorical attempt to co-opt populism, basically. But maybe it's partially that, but it's also just that they don't have a good understanding of how the American state functions.
This is the paleo conservative class theory, and weirdly, the weird guys in the Brooks Brothers suits who hung out with Pat Buchanan have won.
Yeah. And the result
which
of this,
which makes sense. It sounds kind of crypto anti-Semitic.
Yes, precisely.
Pat Buchanan's fingers all over it.
The effect of this is that a Trump coup is very hard to pull off because what they do is just collapse the government, not actually replace it with competent people who can do a coup.
Yep, exactly. So, I mean, ironically, in this analogy, the right would be the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah.
and the center right would be the military in Egypt.
Let's not fool ourselves that like a political collapse of like a large empire is impossible, though.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, it's impossible till it's not.
Exactly.
The thing about America is that it's so split in terms of where power is. So, let me provide an example. The Fashion Institute of Technology is technically classified, according to state law, as a community college. As a result of this, payment for the Fashion Institute of Technology comes from all of the counties around New York. And there are people who are paid to manage the issuance of these payments to this university. And that's how every single thing in the country is run.
Yep.
Nobody knows what is run by whom. And as a result of this, it's very, very difficult for the United States to collapse so long as there's like money somewhere, because there's somebody who'll just be like, oh, I guess this is my job now.
Yep.
Which is
it's kind of one of the brilliant parts of American decentralization, actually, is that it really is a hyper non-fragile at the national level system, but hyper fragile at the local level because it's over complex.
We've created a schizophrenic administrative state.
Don't use schizophrenia that way.
Okay,
but yes,
sorry.
But yes,
very.
So does that make us closer to Yugoslavia than to the USSR?
Kinda, yes. Actually, it kind of does. So that doesn't bode well.
I've heard such things recently. Actually,
that seems really promising. The future is so bright I can barely look.
We all get to have cool like mullets soon.
I hope you're
everyone's
all
gonna
up
smoke
on your
as many cigarettes. It's J.G.
So let's go
over
into
here.
the.
Are you good at accordion?
The right-wing factions.
Not yet,
because I haven't got into that. So we broke down the left-wing factions as the soccer mom Republicans who vote nationally for the Dems, the NPR professional class, the progressives who are the most educated and the whitest and immigrant-iest when they're not white, the social democrats who are also pretty white but also are all over the place. In a lot of other ways, the identitarians who increasingly do not identify with the progressives as they used to, and I think that has to do with wealth, honestly. The old guard machinists, which we didn't mention, but like there's the Clinton machine didn't go away, people. There's the MMTers who kind of matter when Wall Street needs them to matter, but they don't matter the rest of the time, and except as a scapegoat for all the other Democrats to blame when inflation happens. And lastly, which I didn't mention them, but they are a real faction and they have money. Actually, that's another thing about them. They're like one of the far left factions that actually has funding, because millionaires like them if they're into stock speculation.
Yeah.
So there is there's all that on our side, and there's a few other marginal factions we can look at. There's local political machines. A lot of them are dying. Like there's the weird Chicago political machine, which should be considered its own unique and bizarre faction of the Democratic Party. And oh yeah, and there's the rich tough on crime Democrats who were progressives 3 years ago, but are now trying to like move as far right as they can within a Democratic Party policies, and specifically blue states. All right, so we have those factions. All right, now let's look at the right. All right, you have Trumpist, which is the most popular faction, but it doesn't have a coherent ideology, and it never has. I used to actually tell people I don't even consider it fascist, and they were like, "Oh, so you're not afraid of them?" I'm like, "No, I can kind of predict what fascists are going to do. I actually have no idea what Trumpists are going to do. They're not that coherent.
They're encapsulated really, like they reflect the wiles of Trump's personality himself. And you can like tell how odd this is because like today, for example, there's a hurricane alert or a tropical storm alert in Florida. And there's just like a report that surfaced where it's like Trump refuses to evacuate Mar-a-Lago. Because
stay there.
He's been kept in by the blue wave, or you know what I mean. But or you know the fact that like he's so obsessed with image, with winning, with losing. So you see this in the fact that he said he was going to announce on the 15th. His allies are saying, "No, that's a terrible idea. You got completely destroyed," and his response is, "I'll look weaker if I don't do it." And this is the entire way the entire section of that party thinks about him and thinks about everything. Just projection, it's image, it's bluster. But, you know, attached to that bluster is real violence.
Right.
What about the mirror image of the suburban soccer mom, the QAnon soccer moms?
Yes.
We could probably mirror image, like on the liberal side, finding like the conservative mirror image of them, but like QAnon soccer moms is a thing, a terrifying string of words that I've.
And here's the thing with QAnon
real.
soccer moms is they used to be hippies, and a lot of them would consider themselves Democrats until 10 years ago. A lot of them were
Both sides fall under the wine mom umbrella, though, which is also terrifying.
Says a person who is the only female on this panel and is also drinking wine. I
have no children.
That's true.
Joke's on you.
You're the wine non-mom.
Exactly.
Which is a different faction.
It's a different faction. It is a different the wine ant, like the communist wine ant that none of the wine moms let you see.
While we're on the subject of wine, very quickly, the funniest election result of the night is that there were two 49 results in Colorado, one of which Colorado banned the sale of wine in grocery stores, and the other of which was the legalization of psychedelic mushrooms.
Amazing.
Incoherence of American politics.jpg.
That's insane.
Contradictions are flying fast and free, aren't they?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So you have the QAnon soccer mom, or the people burnt by the Medicare QAnon. That's also an interesting route because it comes to the same conspiracy theory channel. You have the former but non-church going evangelical conspiracy theorists. That's the Alex Jones crowd. It's hard to tell how big they actually are. They also overlap with the racialist faction, but they're not coherently racialist. So that's why it's hard to pin it on them. You have the Western cultural chauvinists who are learning to not be white nationalists because that's not going to work.
Bad optics, yeah.
It's not just bad optics. Like even the white nationalists, like Sam Francis actually said that was a non-starter, that white nationalism would never work in the United States. Ironically,
well, if you look at the Proud Boys, they were actually relatively, diverse at the end of the day. Right.
Well, if you see the National Conservative, which is becoming a real faction, although its ideology is unclear to me.
I feel like there's a split in like a lot of those guys between Blake Masters types, J.D. Vance types, and one more that I can't remember. But basically, like, the integralists, the like
The
national,
Patrick Deneen Catholic.
yeah.
Who are the most intellectually serious and also coherent of that group? Which is also why they're not particularly popular, because if you're coherent, there's a lot of stuff about that becomes immediately clear. So they're so coherent that some of the other people who are of the Christian nationalist variety are like, shut up. Like,
I'm the least frightened of them because their whole thesis is that America is a Catholic country, which it most assuredly is not.
Right. No, and Ron Dreyer has said that to them, by the way. Like, it's like, no, you are not in a Catholic. You're not going to establish a Catholic civic theocracy in America.
Yeah, Dreyer basically believes
let's avoid getting bogged down in finding the little micro groups of like weird reactionaries that like are in like the Republican like tent, but they are like they're the Democratic Socialist equivalent.
Right.
On like they are tiny, they're marginal. Like the people that I'm really afraid of are like suburban gun owners. And I'm not saying that as like a person who doesn't have a lot of suburban gun owners in my family, but these are people who are voting on one fucking issue and they are basically wedded to a like, and I say this as a person who, you know, will quote the Marx quote about, you know, the working class shall not surrender, you know, firearms and gunpowder to the bourgeoisie. But at the same time, like there is a huge faction. It's like they're not even all white. It's very broad, and they define themselves in a cultural way around like the access to the tools of violence and a willingness to like basically like murder people that they perceive as threatening. And that is a legit huge faction of the Republican Party's base. So like I love the idea that we can like parse out the little bits of like the weirdos on the right that are completely fucking marginal, and everyone on the right thinks they're marginal. Let's talk about the real big groups that are actually dangerous and armed and have a lot of money that they spend on politics.
Well, this is why one of the interesting things about the last few years, you and I were talking about this, gun sales have collapsed, but ammo sales are still through the fucking roof. And that's probably because we reached market saturation, because leftists also gave up their opposition to gun ownership in the last few years, at least for a little while, although they might be back on it now. Who knows? I can't tell. The issue is the right is a lot of single issue voters. The one thing I was going to say, though, we were getting bogged down in the subfactions of the National Conservative Movement. I think the National Conservative Movement is a real and substantive movement on the right. But
its parts may not be. I mean, its parts can get pretty fringy, but as a whole,
right? Like it is an incredible. It is a mishmash of incredibly fringe weirdos. But in that sense, its analog isn't really the Social Democrats, which maybe what the integralists are, but it is the progressives, right? And it actually exists, I think, as a kind of intellectual proof that, like, look, movement conservatism has collapsed, the moral majority has collapsed, but we are at least an intellectual movement that you can still believe in.
Yeah, and they electorally seemed to be doing very well until last night.
Yep. They were doing quite well until they basically collapsed and stuff in Ohio. But the single issue voters in the GOP, and I think this is important to point out, are successful. Another one is the anti-CRT crowd at the local level. It has not translated to national gains, but it has translated to local gains, and particularly if you can get someone of color to lead the way.
Is this more of an issue for school boards than it is
school boards and local congressional tax? Because this actually did work in Texas for some of the people. I remember, what is it this week? The historical, two of the historical candidates are candidates of color, and they both ran on these kind of issues.
Wow. Okay.
And they're both in the South. And they're both Latin and not black. I mean, there's a whole lot of things I could like go down, and they're not Cuban, so you can't go that route either.
Interesting.
So what you have with that is it's a real faction that overlaps with who we talked about, the QAnon soccer moms. Like, it really does overlap with that. Its base is the families of people who are recently wealthy, but whose wealth is very precarious. And I know that we talked about, some people like, well, the Republicans are the party of rich because it's a $100,000 to $200,000 party. But I'm like, in this day and age, that's not rich in a lot of areas. Like, let's be honest. That's what $60,000 used to be 10 years ago. So, and like, yeah, people like Candace Owens speak to this group. But that's an interesting faction. You still, you also still have the incredibly reactionary ass Business Chamber of Commerce Republicans, and they're a major faction at the local level. So there's that. The evangelicals are now solely the white evangelicals in particular, but not just them, honestly, are now solely a faction of the Republican Party, but they're also dying. But they're a real faction. And I think that leads us to the contradiction that I've been pointing out is we are taking the fact that they are dangerous for the fact that they are massive. They are not massive. They are declining, which is exactly why they are dangerous. Like, they really are losing something.
Because they're desperate. Yeah.
Right. And they're willing to talk Christo-fascism openly now, like, because they're losing.
Do you think that's true, by the way, Derick, with like some of these like hardcore racialist right-wing elements? Because I've noticed, I'm not going to name the publications, but there's racialist publications that have gone from, oh, we're concerned about immigration, to saying we just need a complete immigration moratorium. And, we have to change our language to reflect that. There's sort of these racialist publications that are becoming much more out in the open than they were. Some of the Pat Buchanan adjacent ones from like the 2010s and whatnot are becoming much more explicit.
Like Talkie Mag?
I was thinking VDare, but Talkie's Mag is one as well.
VDare's been explicit for a long time, though.
Yeah.
The thing is, I do think a lot of these guys fall into the same thing that Nurse John is calling the weirdo section. I don't know that they have a lot of real purchase. It's like neo-Confederates. We're always afraid of neo-Confederates, but like, they can't even win local elections in the South. Like, they might.
Well, I'm just saying there's like a parallel between the evangelicals and them losing numbers, and I think, the sort of racialist right. I don't think it works in our current era.
Oh yeah, well, what you see there is, yes, you see people who the racialist right initial appeal was by the same thing that a lot of the identitarians on the other side were trumping, was by 2048 we'll be a majority minority country. Never mind that hasn't meant what they think it means, like in Brazil or anywhere else.
What's very funny about that too is it relies on Hispanics not doing what literally every ethnic group in American history except the descendants of African American slaves have done, which is become white, like, essentially. So I always thought that thesis was like a little problematic historically.
What?
Well, the next Republican presidential candidate need a Mike Pence at this point. Like, how important really are the evangelicals as a swing voting population?
As important as Gen Z is to keeping the Democrats in power, which is to say,
or it's more like as important as keeping unions.
Yeah.
In the Democratic Party, because the church is like the Republican equivalent of like the union hall.
Yeah.
Where you have like people who will turn out to knock on doors, people who will work phones, people who, and there's enough overlap between the evangelical Christians and like the single issue gun people and the QAnon, and we're not even talking about like the anti-vax folks, like in the anti-abortion stuff. This is all like, you don't have to be an evangelical to be anti-abortion. And so
you
I guess
have to
that's
be Christian to be anti-vax.
Yeah.
I mean, one factor that I think we're going to see is the Zionists are actually going to become explicitly Republicans. They kind of there's been some history of that, but AIPAC has been bipartisan until the last 2 rounds.
Sure.
Well, that's because the Israeli political class has been intervening in American presidential politics.
Yep. Another faction I think we're going to have to deal with, although it's a tiny faction, but for different reasons, just because of population numbers, is the ultra-Orthodox Jews, which is, unlike the evangelical Christians, actually a growing faction relative to the Jewish population. But
it's just going to matter in New York, basically.
Yeah, there's very few other states that have such significant numbers, and yet the demographics are always going to go up. Yes,
it matters in New York in a couple of places. So Sean Patrick Maloney is like one of the few races where it matters. But the weird thing about them is they genuinely are swing voters. They just vote as a bloc for whoever promises them the most.
Yes.
And there's actually a fissure going on right now within the community. Like one of the 2 Satmar rabbis, which is one of the larger sects of Orthodox Jews, put out a statement saying that the party had been taken over, or not the party, the religion had been taken over by Trumpists, for example, which is very odd considering that he did not seem super annoyed at Lee Zeldin until he lost and was no longer useful to maintaining yeshiva education. The thing about them is they know they're in New York, and for that reason, maybe they'll swing a couple of elections Republican, but ultimately what they'll do is continue to influence the New York State Senate in a way that makes it difficult to overcome yeshiva education and very little else.
Yeah, and we'll find a lot of government money into weird.
And they're also not like rich, No, they don't have a lot of.
They just have a lot of votes. That's
they
the
have a lot
only
of
thing.
votes in,
but they expect concessions to their own authority.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I realize that everyone who's not Jewish is shutting up right now, but
as you should. No.
I sorry, I don't live in New York, so
yeah. But no, I mean, I do think they're a real faction, because I also think Chabad is increasingly, for different reasons, because Chabad are religious Zionists, Hasidic. They are also increasingly Trump sympathetic or Republican sympathetic, and they're not as given actually towards local patronage because they don't have the voting bloc.
Yeah,
but they do have a lot of influence.
They're important for giving evangelical Zionists cover.
Yeah,
basically.
Yeah.
Which I don't know how significant that is.
Yeah, it's hard to say now. I mean, this is the thing. Will this matter in 10 years? I don't know.
Right.
I do think there was a lot of predictions that and I do think Florida does reflect this. You and I kind of disagree, but Elijah, but Florida illustrates that the idea that it is just totally based on whiteness is not true. I think we agree on that. I think we disagree on the substance of that. But there was a lot of hope that tensions between, say, the LGBT community and, say, the Muslim community in Dearborn might have thrown Michigan. And that did not happen. So whatever frustrations people have with local community ordinances or interactivist disputes did not actually translate into votes. And that's important to notice. So when people ask where are Muslim voters leaning towards, mostly Democratic, but we must remember that the U.S. Muslim diaspora does not reflect the Muslim diaspora of Europe at all.
Where are they on, social conservatism?
It's actually, they're not that socially conservative in general, even compared to but part of that is because they're like Dearborn is Somali refugees.
Right.
Well, they've now been integrated and have 2 and 3 generations in the country, but that's their origin. And then you have there are probably some weird reactionary parts like Muslim Iranian immigrants who don't feel any love for the Islamic Republic. They can be weirdly swingy.
Lebanese businessmen.
Excuse me. Someone says Dearborn isn't Somali, but it is. It's Minneapolis is Somali.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I got my.
I thought Dearborn is
not Yemeni.
Is it Palestinian?
No.
Or,
no.
Dearborn is like a mix.
Arab.
It's Arabic. Yeah.
Where are the Chaldeans? They're somewhere in Michigan.
There's a lot of Chaldeans around like southeast Michigan.
But Chaldeans are not Muslims, so
right.
You can't include them.
They're right.
Chicago has a really large, surprisingly large Palestinian population. Like, I work with a lot of Palestinians. They live out in the southwest suburbs, and also Pakistanis. So, and they tend to. It's interesting because the Pakistani restaurant chain that serves the taxi drivers famously in our town. You go in there and it's full of working class Pakistanis. They are explicitly ACAB. They are explicitly anti-cop. They are very their social media presence at least and this is probably reflective of them handing the keys of that over to some of the younger people involved in running the business. They seem to be on the left side of things.
Yeah.
So here in Chicago, it leans more towards left, progressive, whatever that means.
In Salt Lake too, even though most of the refugees are brought in by the LDS Church, I'll give the LGS one bit of credit. They don't require people to convert to bring them in as refugees, and they're very open to refugees. So we have huge Somali, Yemeni, Lebanese, and Palestinian communities here. There are way more Muslims here than Jews, for example, even though historically Salt Lake City was a Jewish stronghold in the West. And we also have a lot of Iranian relocated here, and they're almost all Democrats. Are they apolitical? And that's probably based on class. They're not particularly reactionary, despite attempts to portray them as so. There's not a whole lot of anti-Semitism. There's not a whole lot of anti-LGBTQ stuff. And I say this in contrast to Europe, where I actually really have seen some of that. So,
of course, sure.
It's just the patterns are very different here. Part of that is the regions where people come from. Part of that is we don't use worker programs and things that keep people deliberately from integrating in society here in the way that they do in Europe. Okay. There's a lot of reasons why it's significantly different. Someone's like, Utah's keeping the dream of compassionate conservatism alive. And yes, it is. And I actually will say why. Utah is one of the few places that has a lot of interclass interaction. And that's because we do have a dominant church that does represent multiple class categories. In the evangelical church, there are working class evangelical churches and rich evangelical churches, just like there are black and white evangelical churches. And that is not the case for the LDS. They are more like Catholics in that regard. The LDS really, 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 really wants to bury its racist past. Really, really hard. That's institutionally, though, that is not necessarily at the individual level. I have experienced more anti-Semitism here than probably anywhere else I've ever lived, except for maybe Egypt, where I kept my racial origins very quiet. But
if we're talking about other factions of the Republican Party, we shouldn't leave out the carbon capitalists, and also the late great Mike Davis was pointing out the gentrification of the rural periphery and how that tends to be driving politics out in rural districts to be further and further to the right.
Yeah, I think we do have to deal with the gentrification of the rural district and the dominance of local petit bourgeois. And that's really a faction. So you do have the carbon capitalist or the Sunbelt capitalist because it's all the carbon industries, but it's also any of the losing intensive manufacturing industries tend to be Republican. One of the reasons why, and Michael Lind, as evil as he can be, is actually right about this. marginal income tax rates are killing them, and marginal business tax rates are killing them because their businesses aren't profitable. All right. It's not because it's onerous; it's that they're not. The profits aren't there, and that's real. And I think that is driving a lot of their interest. And the reason why a lot of people in the rural areas would be loyal to these people is they had a way out, they've left. And if they don't have a way out, they have to work for them. And if they close up, they're fucked. And particularly since a lot of these are small businesses and thus not unionized, are semi-small businesses, mid-range manufacturing that, people say like the My Pillow Republicans. I'd also say just in general, like, the Sun Belt extractivist, they're the people who kind of make sure that Abbott will stay in power in Texas too. They've been the business base of the GOP outside of local petite bourgeois chamber of commerce for the last 3, 4, 5 decades. And they're not going away. What's interesting about them though, John, is we can't predict their ideology because they tend to just back whoever's done whatever other faction is dominant, because they were neoconservatives during the neoconservative period. They've been like Trumpist or paleo-conservative adjacent in this period. They don't really have a clear agenda. Whereas like the military Republicans are actually fading because the paleo-conservatives are isolationists, essentially. And that's kind of a misnomer. They're more just like, we want an empire, but only in like the Americas. We don't care about everywhere else. And I think that is another shift. So you do have this, like, you do have this seemingly anti-imperial Tucker Carlson faction who they really are, a lot of the people who follow him really are concerned about the war state. They don't like the Bushes. They don't like the GOP of the aughts and the 90s. But they're kind of okay with, a Cold War with China as long as we don't actually blow anybody up. And they miss that some of the people in charge do want to blow people up. They ignore that part, and they ignore that part of Tucker Carlson too. But I think that's another major faction.
The Tucker Carlson faction.
And it has sort of put, I think one of the things that we have learned is that the Ukraine situation has kind of made the Republican and Democratic stance on foreign policy utterly incoherent on both sides. Like there's no orientation anymore. I was talking about how Biden was ending the drone program and, idiotically in the way he did it, but still pulling out of Afghanistan. He was being the Hadrian's Wall president. I mean, I'm serious about that. He's like, okay, the empire's fading. Throw up the walls. We're going to maintain what we got. Bye. But I think the Ukraine situation is a way to like have that and also give a whole lot of money to military contractors. So, yeah.
Varn, we got people running out of battery power here, so shall we make our closing arguments pretty soon?
Yeah. What arguments? So, we talked about a lot of very micro stuff, and we talked about these large factions. One thing I can say is, for now, Trumpism has taken a really big hit. And that's probably a bigger story than the Democratic win, is that the GOP bet on Trumpism is too generous to Trump. It is not going to spread elsewhere, but we have no idea what comes after it. And the Democrats don't have their own politics outside of maintaining the progressive elements of the status quo. That's all they got.
And I'm kind of curious if there's anybody, anybody in like politics or media right now at above a certain level who even has the perspective to realize that fact, because it seems like
You mute it yourself.
Yeah.
Anyway, because a lot of people on the they reacted to Trump so bad. A lot of professional media types reacted to Trump so badly on a purely like personal, visceral level that they overinflate like just the thought and like the anxiety and the threat of that. So I was always curious if there's anybody out there who even like has any sort of like approaching the perspective of that, to think of it in that terms. But who knows? Although that might be a topic for another day. Who knows?
I mean, Trump's going to announce in 2 days just because even because he's a laughingstock, and it probably won't work, but it'll give fire to this oppositionary politics for a little while longer. The interesting thing now is, as we said, it doesn't seem like the DeSantis faction of the Republican Party, which consolidated Florida, and that should concern us, is also kind of a laugh because like DeSantis is such a weird, like establishment Trump clone that if Trumpism falls and he's successful, it is unclear what that actually means, except that the Republicans have been playing a good game on making sure that they have strong electoral representation and control in Florida. And so patronist politics won't work there. And also, let's be honest, running a former Republican like Charlie Crist as the answer to Republicans like Rick Scott and Ron DeSantis is really not a persuasive argument.
He's lost as a Republican, a Democrat, and an independent.
Yeah,
statewide.
I think I was just going to say a lot of that is like just. I think that's part of the problem here in Florida. Call me naive, but I just think Democrats gave up on Florida a long time ago. It's not like money was put into these elections here. So.
No, actually, one thing I will tell you from we mentioned Adrian Delgado earlier, and I will say this: he won't get mad at me for saying this. The Florida Democratic Party has actually been totally gutted. Yeah. And one of the things that we should be worried about people who care about the Democrats in the future is that so many of these political apparatuses are actually personality based. Like we talked about with Abrams and Beto, they are not institutionally based.
Entrepreneurs or political
entrepreneurs. Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
And so when they fail, that apparatus goes with them and there's nothing to replace it. So there is that. I think also we don't know what the Supreme Court's going to do in the next few years, and it's interesting if John Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett are going to, and I say Amy Coney Barrett because she's super reactionary on some things, but not others.
She voted not to hear the student loan challenge, for example.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I wonder if she might be weirdly our super duper Catholic pro-life weirdo, but who's also Sandra Day O'Connor on other issues. Gorsuch is another one who's hard to predict because he actually really cares about indigenous stuff, interestingly enough. He's been stopping a lot of anti-indigenous are being a voice with the liberals on that. So we don't know what they're going to do. And I think the Democrats at the national level are kind of hoping they are just as reactionary as we predicted they would be, because it is good for their voting base.
I mean, do we think that they've learned a lesson after this? Like watching, Roe v. Wade be repealed and then watch the actual, political consequences potentially of that. Do we think that they may hold themselves back? I'm concerned that Bezos is gonna basically destroy. I mean, there's pros and cons to it, and I hate me some union bureaucrats, but wow, if they decide to dismantle the National Labor Relations Act, that's going to really fucking crank the heat up on a lot of different places.
And there's a real chance actually that they might. Because
so I don't know, that's where we're kind of now we're in this kind of wild zone, there be dragons sort of thing, and I don't know if they're gonna feel what the repercussions of that could be. I'm always wondering, it's always a tension, how real politique is this particular faction of the ruling class? Do they understand what it looks like when the NLRB doesn't hold back workers?
I honestly think that everybody is super earnest. I don't think anybody's real politique. I think everybody seriously believes that people agree with them, and also that they're victims of everybody else. I also don't think the NLRB would be struck down. I think there'll certainly be limitations on it, but I think it's really, really unlikely. Down.
No, but the idea that very rarely can't go through the Democratic Congress. I mean, not the Democratic Congress, but the Supreme Court. Don't distract me when I'm trying to make an important point. I don't think I will say this: the Supreme Court historically has favored things like the ability of a private sector people to sue. And there is a case right now coming up to the Supreme Court, which will mean that businesses can sue labor unions for losses during strikes, which effectively does backdoor completely fuck the National Labor Relations Act.
No, certainly, but I don't think it's not going to be a visible thing in this case. I think that's the perfect example of the kind of anti-union action they're doing, which is, it's not so much calculated to avoid a backlash like Dobbs. It's calculated to adhere to the standards of contemporary law, which require big changes to be made in these seemingly minute ways. And that case I'm following very closely, and it's a very good example of one of the worst outcomes that could happen from the Supreme Court.
The thing, Elijah, is that I don't know that that's going to be satisfactory to people like Jeff Bezos.
I don't know. They're not in charge of the court,
They're not, but they can put cases in front of the court. So I just don't know.
I mean, we've had millionaires be able to, like, for example, completely devastate affirmative action. Not a policy that I actually think was ever that smart, but completely devastate it by just barraging the courts with it, weakening it. And I'm going to tell you the other thing where I'm not as sanguine is the railroad workers situation, which is not covered by the the National Labor Relations Board or the National Labor Relations Act anyway. And like teachers unions aren't either. These issues are issues that are going to explode on the Democrats soon. They were able to buy time. They're ticking time bombs.
It's going to be great when Warnock loses the runoffs because there's a railroad strike.
Maybe, but you gotta remember Trump will have announced by then, and
they'll cancel. Trump will have announced that he is running only if the railroad strike does not go forward. he'll be the intervention.
So yeah, I don't know. I think, I feel good that the Trumpists lost, but I feel terrible that I don't see a faction of the U.S. left. And this includes, and I know I'm going to anger the non-electoralist here, but also the non-electoralist who have any non-exhausted will the power outside of the new union movement. And I also don't think the new union movement has really gained enough traction yet for us to know how it's going to go. Which is not a reason not to support it. In fact, it's a reason to support it. And this is the one thing that I think we all here could agree with, even the most obnoxious of the social democrats on, is we need, except for weird LaRoucheite bizarros on Twitter who get a lot of tweets, is that we need to support the Amazon stuff and Bezos. But I will say this is what's driving factions of the tech billionaire elite away from the Democratic Party. And that's going to be a new scenario. And if they're not afraid of Trump, I don't know what they're like. If Trump is no longer their fear, I don't know where they land, because like fear of Trumpism will keep Bezos in line, but because of the weirdness of Trumpism, it makes his business hard. But if you have some other more conciliatory to capital faction of the Republicans emerge that we don't currently yet have, who can also unite all these weird single issue voters, they might really be a real problem in 2024. Or if not in 2024, in 2028. Because the other thing I'm going to say is we're like 10 years behind Europe. And if you look at Europe as an analog for here, the future actually is not bright. But I also realize there are some differences, like the American youth are not nearly as reactionary as European youth, etc. But I don't know that that's permanent.
That's a scary thought.
There's a lot up in the air. Yeah.
If you want to look at 10 years in the future in the United States, just look at what's happening in California. That's always been true. Like California is probably far more predictive than anywhere else.
A trifecta of democratic governance that gets nothing done. Wonderful.
So Canada. So we become the shitty
with literal militia, with militias posting up outside of the aid distribution centers during your your local version of climate catastrophe. So it'll be democratic governance ruling over a police state and a techno-feudal economy with like militias roaming around the hinterlands, basically shaking down anyone that they think doesn't look white enough or speak English with the right accent. As the fires are raging, fires or floods.
So basically, take California and Arizona and press them together.
Oh,
that's great. I'm going to use that from now on.
Everyone should just read more Mike Davis.
Yes, we know Mike Davis.
Arizona's
rest in
the
peace
state because it should not exist. I fervently believe Phoenix should not be a city. It's got no natural aquifer. It's a monument. It's like our version of the Tower of Babel. It's a monument to man's hubris.
They have cool fossils, but they use way too much air conditioning. So I'm down with just flattening that. Could be really good parking spaces for the rest of California.
I love how people think that you're going to get out of climate change by dying. This is like we're all gonna die and climate change is gonna stop this. No, it's not. You're gonna live in the post-apocalyptic hellscape. Like I might die because I'm like a Gen Xer, or like half of us here die. But the Elijahs of the world, no, you motherfuckers are gonna deal with this.
Hey, we're having a great time personally. No, I mean, I think really, you've left us with Phoenix, and we'll have to make do.
Good luck.
Oh man.
And on that bright and shining note, I'm gonna head out. Good night, everybody.
All right. Good night.
Good night.
I'd like to thank everybody. Elijah, you were very useful. JG, thank you for being Florida man, and Jordan, thank you for representing both those of us who are not male identified and also those of us who are Californians.
Don't put that on me. I'm sorry. Just kidding. I was happy to be here. Thank you.
Jews are overrepresented on this panel. So
when is that not the case? No, I just wanted to say, it's been interesting, as it's always kind of interesting. We were overpromised. Everybody underdelivered. A little bit more of the same. And don't put too many of your eggs in the electoralism basket, because neither the Democrats nor the Republicans will be our salvation to a better future.
Is it Democratic Party celebration stream? No, this is the post ambivalent. The worst didn't happen, and things are not as awful as we thought. But I didn't even get to man, there's so much we didn't touch. We didn't touch why the polling situation was so weird.
Because what?
They're fraudulent.
They're fraudulent. That's got to be close to it. The truth, right there.
Actually, there's a real truth to that, because there were a lot of the mainstream polling were adjusting for conservative polling. It's like trying to adjust their results to mirror the conservative polling stuff, because they were told that Trumpists didn't respond to the polls correctly, so that they were overcorrecting. And the other thing is, Zoomers and younger millennials are not easily reachable by landlines, and all these things still largely rely on landlines. I get polling questions from private institutions all the time, but these other things don't come to me.
You can do polls on TikTok and Twitter, right? Maybe they'll try that next time.
Yeah.
Text. I did get a poll via text.
Right. And 538 was actually, it was people within 538 who were pointing out how many weird Republican polls they were including. And so they had an off-light poll that didn't include the adjustments, and it actually was much more correct. But they were spooked into accepting these right-wing poll numbers.
So many of these people have no idea about the concept of working the refs. It's like, it's a thing, people. Come on.
But I mean, the other thing I will say is, if you're a Democratic national leader, where Elijah, I think the one thing I will say to you, Elijah, is I think you're right about most people, except for Joe Biden. You cannot convince me that Joe Biden is an earnest man, because he's been all over the political spectrum his entire life.
No, I don't think he's earnest. I think he's sort of earnest. He's not earnest about politics. He's earnest about like ice cream and himself.
Yes. And
yeah,
like
he's earnest, scared, stupid.
Yeah, I mean,
Thank you. I had about 5 options in that joke, so I went with that one.
I think he's earnest, like standing, like fucking with the Queen, and which I'm also earnest about. I know that my British listeners get all mad when I'm like, yeah, we shouldn't be. I don't care. Like, although he did when she died, I guess, to make up for it, we had this big whole like half-mast flag thing.
My head so bad, I could not believe what I was saying.
Yeah, I was like, there's been presidents we didn't do that for.
No,
So, at least not for that long. Like,
no, wow, it was so long. He's earnest if he challenges you to like a push-up match as well.
Yeah.
Or says, "Listen, fat," which I.
Yeah, no, he was wonderful in those things.
Yeah.
But I do agree with you that the factions mostly do. I actually have a cynical view of on non-cynicism, which is I believe most people actually believe what they say, which is sad.
Yeah.
Like, I actually wish there was more cynicism, because a lot of horror is born out of people being gullible. But and I believe that's true for a lot of the politicians too. I don't believe that's true for a lot of the quote deep state actors, but those people actually just want the country to run. That's all they care about. They don't really care about this stuff ideologically at all. So as somebody asking, will Joe Biden invade Haiti? Fuck if I know. I will say this: this administration has been particularly hard to gauge on foreign politics. Actually, like the NATO response and consolidating NATO makes perfect sense, but it's also
the Afghanistan withdrawal was like, very few presidents have been willing to do something like that, because it looks terrible.
Yeah, it looks bad. And it was mismanaged, but he's right. I mean, like, it was the right thing to do.
He did it too.
But it was also weirdly popular. Like, it was unpopular that it went the way it did, but everybody pretty much thinks it should have happened. Like, I don't know, the Obama administration.
Yeah.
Do you really think Biden's been that hard to gauge on foreign policy? It just seems like he's committed towards shifting towards, Russia and China. That's what we're going to be concerned about, sort of moving away from the Mideast stuff, and maybe even Latin America at this point.
I think it's actually harder to predict what he's going to do for Latin America, and that actually affects things a lot more. And that also includes what he's going to do in the Caribbean, like Haiti. It is easy to predict what he's going to do about Russia and China and NATO, although he's going to escalate with China more carefully than Trump, and he's going to back down on certain things and very quietly. Like, for example, that weird statement that Trump put in about Taiwan. He even though he let Pelosi, or maybe he didn't but he didn't insert a lot of counterpower to Pelosi's stunt. He also removed a lot of language about that changed the status quo on Taiwan from the State Department website. So on these things, he's not expansivist. He's also weirdly been good on drones. He's the first American president to be good on drones since we've had them.
He's had very, very mixed impulses on historic foreign policy mistakes. I mean, not a lot of people know this, but he went in as like an anti-Vietnam guy, which shows how old he is. And then he voted against the first Gulf War. and was a brutal cheerleader for the war in Iraq. So he's a little hard to place. He's not really
very true.
Now that Bibi's back in office, I'm very curious what he's going to do vis-a-vis Iran, because obviously Obama had his own little plan, and then Trump backed out of that.
Well,
So,
I mean, the other
what
thing
now?
in which he's been hard to gauge on is what Trump policies he's actually going to try to undo, and which ones he's just going to
And when? Fucking Jesus.
and which ones he's going to do what I like to call the Guantanamo Bay strategy from Obama, which is to say you're going to do something, and the moment it gets hard at all, immediately pretend you never said it.
I actually think we'll kind of see his regulatory moves if Republicans win the House, because the reason he's stayed kind of off on regulation is because he wants to smooth Joe Manchin's fragile ego and defer to the Senate, that great governing body. So we'll figure out a lot more if he has a bad night as they count the votes. Okay, on that note, I really have to
go. It's like 3 a.m. over there, and
it's midnight, but it feels like 3 a.m.
Who's in London?
I promised my girlfriend that I would say her election prediction, which is a perfect tie in everything.
Wow.
So on that note, thank you everyone for watching. Thank you, Varn, for having me. Thank you guys for being wonderful. I'll see you around.
Right.
Thanks, Elijah.
Bye, Elijah, who is
That's the future of our country. Don't fear.
Yeah, he's also he's a Christopher Lash scholar. He's one of my favorite ones. Of people who don't know who he is, I like him because it's more than us millennials and Gen Xers talking for once.
That was a great episode. Except neither of you could say the name Avenelli.
Yeah,
you made him Italian. Averni. It was cute. I liked it.
Avenelli. For those who don't know our dynamic, Jordan likes to make fun of the fact that I read Hebrew but don't actually speak it, which is the way I am about most languages, including English. So
I would never make fun of someone with aphasia. I just point out the inconsistencies is all, lovingly.
Well, I'm really terrible at pronouncing Hebrew, actually. It's like real bad. And I don't read Arabic, even though I tried. My Arabic listeners can mock me. I tried for like 6 months and was like, this is hard. You have the letters change.
They're all stuck together and stuff.
They're not just stuck together, but you write them differently depending on where they are in the sentence. And I know we do that in English too, but this pisses me off. It's difficult. Also, use your diacritical marks. God damn it.
No, we have the same problem in Hebrew. It sucks. Like random letters with the end of the sentence. No diacritical mark. You're just guessing a pronunciation until you know the whole lexicon. Great, efficient way to do language. Yeah. Anyway.
All right. Thank you all. Goodbye. JG, go to bed. Jeremy, I don't know. What do you do in Portland? Like burn a business or something? Like, I don't know.
Go to
it was people legally distinct from me who were downtown during the uprising. I wasn't there. All I'm gonna say is, thanks everybody for tuning in and listening to our prolonged discussion and whatnot. If you haven't yet, subscribe to the Patreon, to this channel, because there's much more stuff here. Tune into This is Revolution tomorrow night at 6 o'clock West Coast time for more fun, and a lot of those same faces will show up once in a while.
Tomorrow night for about an hour I will also have an emergency discussion with Strange Matters editor John Michael Colon on the crisis of social democrats in regards to the Democrats. So we're not done yet. And I will have a series of election special solos for about 2 weeks, where I talk about specific issues as they become clear and as I see narratives on the left that are false. So
what time is your thing tomorrow?
It'll be before TIR. I try not to overlap with TIR or with Left Reckoning or with any of the other 85,000 fucking shows that I have to not overlap with.
I forgot Movie Night Extravaganza.
You
sometimes overlap with them.
I sometimes overlap with them. And tonight was unplanned. So I would also like to thank the panel because they all came on in 4 hours notice or less.
I'm sorry if I didn't contribute as much as usual, but I'm just like burnt out from all this election nonsense.
I was about to say, and you're in Florida, I would hate life too. I mean, like,
yeah, it's like I would have been here earlier, but I had a chiropractor appointment, had to get my back cracked, so I'm doing much better now. But anyway,
yep. And with that note, good night. Have a good evening.
Good night.
Bye,
Love your cat, y'all.
All right, where's the button? Where's the button? I'm too
Push the
tired.
button,
to
Frank.
the
We're
button.
stuck here forever. Sorry.
Ah!